Chapter 376. Sunday breakfast in the Great Hall of Hogwarts always brought variety to the diet, and for those who were too deeply immersed in their affairs or studies, these same breakfasts could fix the sudden end of the week. More meat, more pastries, more sweets. There was always more of everything on Sunday, except for the students on this day. Many were late for breakfast, but the house elves, in any case, served everyone, even if this everyone would come much later. On this, without a doubt, a wonderful day for many, absolutely free, satisfying, and due to the weather also promising to be sunny, I only felt a slight tension and dislike for individuals who came to breakfast in full. Daphne and Astoria were also here, but they were sitting in the middle of the female half of the house, although earlier, like almost half of the Slytherins, they communicated with peers of the opposite sex. "What are you thinking about?" Without taking her razor-sharp gaze away from the Slytherins, Hermione suddenly spoke, and cutting off a sausage with a knife, she made a deep scratch in the soft metal of the plate. "I don't know." Such an answer caused Hermione to look at me with a slightly surprised look. "Are you sliding down to the level of some individuals?" "No, it's just..." I twirled the glass of juice in my hands. "I already know how, what and when I'm going to do, and thinking about it once again is just overthinking. By the way, yes, what exactly are you up to?" The students who were crowding at our table gradually sat down more and more tightly, and now it becomes problematic to talk without witnesses. "Hi," a sleepy Seamus nodded to us, and Dean, who appeared with him, was, as always, in a perfectly fitting uniform, and looked cheerful. "Hello, guys. We have secrets here, so..." I smiled guiltily, and the guys just nodded understandingly. More precisely, only Dean nodded, and Seamus ignored the phrase, starting to lazily poke a fork in the portion of food that appeared his brain needs a little time for the smell and sight of food to trigger the necessary thought process. Straining a little and putting a privacy charm around myself and Hermione without a wand, I looked at the girl sitting next to me. "The trial. A case was concocted yesterday, all that sort of thing. And what are you going to win from this trial?" "When we're not going to win anything there, Miona. The point is different. Publicly announce their goals, their loyalty to the Dark Lord, instill doubts in people's minds about their reputation. Publicly, so that everything is documented. In addition, it is a preemptive strike to preserve your reputation and a move ahead of time if they suddenly decide to expose you and the girls guilty. The mental blow will be dealt very soon, and the physical one, after the trial." "Physical here at Hogwarts?" No, I shook my head. "I will not frame the headmaster like that. I'm with you." "But my own..." "And you won't talk me out of it," she interrupted me. "I haven't been torturing myself for years to end up hiding behind the backs of others. That's not for me to decide." "Who will wait?" "I'll text her." We continued to finish our breakfast, and I kept glancing over at the Slytherin table, and more specifically, at Daphne and Astoria. They were pretending like everything was fine, but they were acting a little atypical. Not so easy, was it, Miona? I turned to the girl when all that was left of breakfast was juice in glasses. "Are you good with charms?" Apparently, the girl thought, straightening a strand of tidied, curly hair. "My part of the library had more books on charms than you do." "Apparently," I repeated, wondering what I even needed. "There are protean charms of the signal type with an activator by situation or phrase or all at once." Hermione thought for a few seconds. "Yes. I've been researching various variations of magical means of communication in my spare time, and there was one like this among them." "What do you need it for?" "To make 4 linked artifacts. My mentor asked me to keep an eye on the girls, and without an emergency alarm, it's extremely problematic." "I see. I can do it, but only with a wand. There are a lot of incomprehensible things in the structure." "Okay." After quickly thinking over all the ideas, I came to a simple, logical, and obvious option: rings. Immediately transfigured from the air 4 steel rings with an engraved rune chain to fit the size and strength on the outside. I handed them to Hermione, receiving a surprised look. "Now. And then look for them all over the castle." "That's also true," Hermione nodded and, unnoticed by those present both at our table and at the high table, took out a wand and began to draw tiny loops over the rings with it, quietly saying something. Half a minute later, I held 4 rings in my hands, one of which was lying separately. This, Hermione pointed her finger at the lone ring. The main one. It will receive signals from the other 3, and you can easily figure out who it is from. How? I'm not sure, Hermione shrugged, and the students were already starting to slowly leave the Great Hall. You'll just know. Chapter 377. I took a piece of parchment out of my bag, tore off 2 pieces, and used magic to create an explanatory note for Astoria and Daphne. Finding the girls, I asked Rowena. Can you reach them before they leave? Yes. Putting the 2 rings and the notes in my pocket, I immediately felt them disappear, and by all appearances, they should appear in the pockets of the girls' robes. I gave 1 ring back to Hermione, and she put it on her left hand without a doubt, and I put mine on my left hand as well, next to Ouroboros' ring. All that remains is to prepare for what is to come, though I don't yet know what exactly. Miona. Are you sure you're all right standing up from the table? I addressed the girl. Yes, she nodded. Of course, if it weren't for a clemency, I would have been absorbed in something like resentment, disappointment, fear, and on the basis of this, anger at these people. Just like yesterday. But now, I can easily control these impulses without winding myself up. Almost until dinner, we either studied something new in the library, or I taught Hermione the shadow transfiguration spells I had created based on the architect's abilities. But my inner tension was still there, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't figure out the reason for it. Perhaps I'm just worried about the upcoming trial, or maybe because of Lady Greengrass's unknown plans so far. The mirror vibrating in my pocket distracted me from wasting my time in the walls of the restricted section. Taking it out, I saw in the reflection an nymphadora in the shape of an auror, and in the background, there were houses near the centre of London. Max, how's the mood? She spoke in an exaggeratedly chipper voice. Suspiciously lousy. Something wrong? I wanted to tell you that the hearing is scheduled for 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The parents of those guys made a fuss and also dragged their application, as you expected. As a result, as Madame Bones said, according to the preliminary analysis of the materials, the hearing will not be specifically on charges but to clarify the degree of guilt in the imputed actions of each individual involved in the case, and the 2 groups in general. I see. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? It makes no difference at all, but I'll say this, I don't understand paperwork. I am not an investigator or a DMLE prosecutor. Okay, I said what I wanted. I'll be in touch. The image disappeared, and I put the mirror back in my pocket, returning to working out the craziest combinations of my abilities and spells. It is unknown what I will have to face in the near future. However, there is at least one plus in the information received. The strange tension has disappeared. Monday, the 13th of November, started quite exciting. No, the standard exercises were the usual, although Hermione tried even harder, but that's not the point. As usual, almost everyone came to breakfast in the Great Hall on time, and after the already well-established 15 minutes, postal owls flew into the hall. There were quite a lot of them, but it is understandable, in addition to mail from relatives, on Monday, as on a couple of other days of the week, correspondence came by subscription, including the Daily Prophet. Catching my copy in the air, I started reading with interest, and already on the 2nd page, I came across an interesting article by Skeeter. Judging by the faces of the happy owners of subscriptions to this miracle from the yellow press, widespread interest and at least 2 weeks of gossip are expected. And the thing is that Skeeter went against the threats. Now we all have the opportunity to contemplate an article that describes in detail, albeit without specific names, but with hints, about the preparation, collection of information, and implementation by Slytherins of their insidious plan, which stumbled upon the unexpectedly superior forces of just one Muggle-born girl. It's all served up with the perfect sauce of mockery of the children from the old families, surprise and outrage at what happened, and indignation at the fact that the Slytherins are promoting the return of the Dark Lord and starting all sorts of outrage in his name. At the same time, Skeeter didn't forget to praise herself, saying, even despite the obliviate and threats, she risked her health and life in order to keep her loyal readers informed, getting this information. The conclusion was, would our valiant ministry really allow rich bullies to bury the career of a prominent Muggle-born? Which I will tell you about this, loyal readers, after the Wizengamot trial, which will take place today, and your faithful servant will cover this case. Chapter 378. What do you think? I turned to Hermione, nodding at the paper. It's a little too loud. What do you think the wizard's reaction will be? I thought for a moment. Given that outwardly the Ministry is trying to pursue a policy of supporting Muggleborns, an incident like this should either be seen as no one is to blame, everyone is bad, or in our favor. However, I found out here that they will be considered a little differently because of a countersuit from the parents of these people. In general, the incident will be considered in such a way as to understand the guilt of each one specifically, and not all together. So what of it? Given that some people's relatives are members of the Wizengamot, reviewing the case individually for each will only eliminate one of the radicals from the vote, not the entire group. That's a disadvantage. On the other hand, it doesn't matter if Mr. Goober and I get the information right. Will it affect the laws? This is the Wizengamot, and the crux of the matter is not so ordinary. Yes, many things will not be considered as evidence so as not to create a precedent. Still, they will be considered as the material that influences the solution and clarifies the essence of the problem, easily. What's the point? Discrediting. The Dark Lord will surely reveal himself soon, and with him these families. If you correct our situation even a little bit, society will think, the poor purebloods are being beaten by a Muggleborn witch, and they, by virtue of their upbringing, didn't raise their hand against the girl, but the girl tortured them so much that they themselves easily fell into the clutches of the Dark Lord's deception. But if they are initially guilty, such a maneuver will not work. Of course, we don't have to live in a magical world. It's not for nothing that we get an ordinary education. But it is desirable that everything be normal. After such an informative dialogue, we went to class, where at the very first lesson, McGonagall told us to come to the headmaster's office at 4:30 today. The whole day was spent waiting and watching the students speculate about what had happened and which Muggleborn had beaten up a large group of Slytherins. However, there weren't many options, so sometimes they looked at Hermione with interest, but somehow they already knew who exactly had visited the hospital wing from Slytherin. At 4 o'clock, Hermione and I returned to the common room and our rooms in order to change our school uniforms into decent everyday ones. My status doesn't allow me to dress too simply now, just like Hermione, but I didn't tell her that she's smart, she'll figure it out. But, on the other hand, my casual black suit with a rare stripe is not cheap at all, very high quality, and looks more than decent, so I just put on silver accessories with tiny but noticeable ruby inserts. The meeting of the Wizengamot requires a certain dress code, but only if you are directly among the judges, and if you yourself are on the case, then any business clothes are enough, and therefore a cloak and a cane. When I walked back down to what I thought would be an empty common room, since the students were still in class, I found Hermione in a black dress, boots, and a black robe on top of it. Her hair was pretty bouffant, but it wasn't messy, though it might have looked that way. Part of the hair on the left was tightly pressed to the head with a thin silver barrette, and the rest, it would seem, was in free flight. "Ready?" the girl immediately asked me as soon as I showed up in the aisle to the men's side. "Absolutely. Let's go." We quickly left the common room and, strictly at the specified time, reached the headmaster's office, the passage to which was open. There was no one in the office beside the headmaster himself. "Mr. Knight, Miss Granger," he nodded, getting up from his desk. "It's time to go to the ministry hearing. Mr. Goober is already waiting for us there." And the others asked Hermione as the headmaster approached the fireplace in his office. "You mean the students from Slytherin?" He turned around, flashing his half-frame glasses. "They are led by Professor Snape through the fireplace in his office. I think you know how to use a fireplace, don't you?" Of course, we nodded simultaneously. "Great," the headmaster smiled, taking a handful of fluo powder from a special stand beside the fireplace. "We are going to the Ministry of Magic, Atrium. Remember?" We nodded again, and the headmaster threw fluo powder into the fireplace, turning the fire in it green. "You go in first, and I, in case you make a mistake, will go after you. You are not coming with us, aren't you?" the chairman of the Wizengamot. "Not anymore," the headmaster shook his head. "Not long ago, not without the help of Minister Fudge, I was removed from that position. However, I am indeed coming with you, but as a listener and witness." "So is Madame Pomfrey." Nodding, I took some fluo powder, stepped into the fireplace, and said, "Ministry of Magic, Atrium." I immediately threw flow powder under my feet, and I was sucked into a whirlwind of movement, quite quickly taking me to the fireplace in the long, spacious, and high hall I had already seen, with a dark parquet floor and black tiles around the edges. There were relatively few people here now, but everyone was moving somewhere and pretending to be extremely busy people, although perhaps it was so. Hermione followed me out of the fireplace, and a few seconds later, the headmaster emerged from the green flames, heading in the direction he knew best, and so we followed. Chapter 379. After walking through the hall, we had to check in at the guard post, where they weighed our wands and gave us the appropriate passes, and then we got to the elevators, one of which we had to go down almost to the lowest level. Although, as I know, this is the lowest level for general access, with only the Department of Mysteries below. We followed the headmaster again, and there were not many people in these corridors. At the door of one of the offices stood the slightly hunched old man I knew, in a business suit, robe, and a small black hat, Mr. Goober. "Hello," I said to the lawyer, and Hermione gave a slight curtsy. "Hello, young man, lady. Albus. How are things? Basically, you can come in and sit down." The rest of the defendants did so. "I'll tell you right away, Mr. Knight, and you, Miss Granger, are assigned chairs in the center of the room." On behalf of all the other defendants in the case, Lady Greengrass, as responsible for her daughters, and Mr. Morris, as a lawyer representing the interests of the others, will be present. "And you?" Usually, the defense side does not take the place of the person involved in the case, but in cases where there are more than 4 people on one side, exceptions are made. Then, the headmaster looked at the wide doors of hall number 10, "Let's not waste any time." The headmaster opened the doors and stepped inside the hall, and we followed. I could tell at once that it was a different hall, and it was already clear before. The Wizengamot has not only a judicial function, but also a parliamentary one, and the courtroom is not at all where organizational meetings are held, which to me is nonsense. The center of the hall was the lower level in a large oval shape, as if 2 circles were joined by lines. In fact, these 2 imaginary circles were displayed by the intricate floor tiles, as if dividing the hall into 2 halves, for the judges and for the audience, with the defendants, witnesses, and other participants. Up from the oval were several rows of bleachers, and where about 50 whispering wizards in plum robes with the letter W embroidered on them now sat, there were 3 other prominent seats, for the chairman and chief warlock, for the head of the DMLE, and for the minister or his assistant. Only 2 of them were currently occupied, and they were taken by Amelia Bones and Dolores Umbridge. Dumbledore led Hermione and me to 2 of the 4 chairs that faced the members of the Wizengamot. Lady Greengrass was already sitting in one of them, wearing a navy blue dress and a black robe. An important man in his 40s hurried to the second seat when he saw us and somewhat fussily took it. Hermione sat down, full of dignity, shaking her mane of hair a little, holding her head high, proudly. The old Wizengamot men stared at her with surprise and mute shock, but I could understand them. Equally surprised looked the few of the parents who came along with their very dickish but beloved offspring, who figure in this case. But I wouldn't be me if I hadn't noticed a completely unfamiliar woman next to Narcissa, who was looking at us with all her eyes and didn't hide her surprise. Interesting. After looking around the hall, I took my seat, looking at the members of the Wizengamot. A lot of old ones, a lot indeed. But there were some relatively young ones among them, and even some I knew. Here, for example, if I'm interpreting the face that has changed with age correctly, sits Hannah Abbott's grandfather. I've seen him in magic photos from the old days. There's Augusta Longbottom, a flinty grandmother with the appearance of a quiet and harmless lady. However, this appearance is radically changed by almost a military posture. Rowley, Travers, Parkinson, of course, not all of the sacred ones were here. Some families were suppressed, some I don't know at all, and others are wanted from young to old. Somewhere behind us were suspiciously bad-looking guys from Slytherin with their relatives. On the sides were several spectators, among whom Skeeter could be seen, and another place was occupied by Percy Weasley, and, apparently, now he will be a secretary. There was another exit from the hall, but now it was closed, and at the very top, along the perimeter, if you look closely, you can see Aurors. If my memory serves me correctly, they were obliged to be here after the cases in the early 80s when criminals ended up directly in the courtroom, and the case of Barty Crouch Jr. was not the only one. By the way, I don't know if he and his father are alive. Though, what can happen to the junior in Voldemort's camp? Fudge entered the hall at a brisk pace in a robe with the letter W and proceeded to the place of Chief Warlock. Now it is clear who took the vacant place after Dumbledore. Chapter 380. Is everyone here? Fudge took a cursory look around the room. Fine. The minister took his seat. Mr. Weasley, he nodded to Percy, who activated several quick quills that fluttered over the parchment. So, Fudge spoke in an important tone. As Chief Warlock and Chairman of the Wizengamot, I declare a hearing on the case. The minister glanced at the table in front of him. At number 725. Please note the presence of all current members of the Wizengamot, Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement Amelia Bones, Deputy Minister of Magic England Dolores Umbridge. The appearance of the defendants in the case. Mr. Goober rose from his seat. My clients, Maximilian Knight and Hermione Granger, are here. Delphine stood up next. Daphne and Astoria Greengrass are here. My clients, the man stood up, are all present. Fine, nodded Fudge. Let's proceed to the consideration of the heart of the matter. Let me ask a question, the Slytherin lawyer interjected, and Fudge nodded. Why is such an insignificant case being considered by the full Wizengamot? As you should know, Fudge looked condescendingly at the lawyer. Cases involving an active member of the Wizengamot are considered only and only in full. May I clarify, who? Maximilian Knight, as the representative of the House of Black Interests. Any more questions? A wave of quiet whispers swept through the hall but quickly subsided. No, Your Honor. Due to the presence of allegations from both sides, the case will be considered not in relation to two groups of wizards, but in relation to each, in particular, to clarify the severity of the crime, if the fact of such is found, in relation to each person involved in particular. Initial charges: the attack of 12 Hogwarts senior students on 3 Hogwarts senior students, with the use of spells that go beyond safe and conditionally safe, as well as with the use of 2 of the 3 unforgivable spells, with the purpose of physical and psychological violence. Counterclaim: significant excess of permissible self-defense with moderate A&D. Severe. Fudge looked at the Slytherins sitting behind me, who almost on cue pretended to be half dead, even groaning. Degree of severity. The look on Fudge's face said, "You serious?" In fact, it was about the same expression on the faces of the rest of the Wizengamot. Hermione took on an even prouder look. So, Fudge returned a serious look to his face. The floor is given to Daphne Greengrass or her representative. Delphine got up from her chair and quickly and clearly told the story of how in the corridor of Hogwarts dungeons, Mr. Theodore Nott Jr., who is a classmate of Daphne Greengrass, called the girl away for a private conversation, during which he tried, walking behind the girl, unnoticed to impose Imperio on her. Daphne managed to turn around and draw her wand, but no more than that. Later on, there was a description of the psychological state from Daphne's words, and after that, she woke up tied up in the office. The rest of the story was already known, and Delphine didn't skimp on the details, describing everything that happened, albeit from Daphne's words. Then a story on behalf of Astoria, in which Daphne asked her sister to come to the office for a conversation, and she came, having received Incarcerus in the face. Only after that did Astoria see that Hermione, paralyzed by Petrificus, was also in the office. All certified materials and examinations are attached to the case. Delphine finished and sat down with a nod from Fudge. It is worth saying that as Delphine's monologue progressed, the members of the Wizengamot actively studied the folders with materials that lay in front of them. Next, they heard Hermione's testimony, but it was Mr. Goober who gave it. We had agreed that the simple legal questions and subtleties would be left to him, and the tricky, but not legal, questions would be left to me. We would only answer questions addressed directly to us personally. In general, Hermione's situation was even simpler. Daphne asked to come to one of the rooms for discussion and practice in the runes, in which they have been discussing a lot together for a long time. She came, got a nonverbal wandless Petrificus, and for a long time tried to take it off herself just as nonverbally and without a wand while listening to everything that was going on around her. She succeeded at the very end, and Hermione was able to dodge a crucio sent to her by Selwyn. We have listened to the testimony of one of the parties, concluded Fudge. Now, let's move on to the second side. Chapter 381. The lawyer of the Slytherins, Mr. Morris, began to voice this very testimony, which, in brief, stated a simple position: the guys gathered together and decided to scare the girls. Yes, not seriously, yes, inappropriate behavior, but nothing that had been said before. This is in short. In addition, on behalf of the Slytherins, it was said that Hermione allegedly attacked them immediately upon seeing them, and they were confused, and indeed beating girls is a mauvaise ton. Of course, all this was also submitted to the members of the Wizengamot in writing, and the defense and prosecution of the Slytherins were based both on influence and on the fact that there is no real evidence at all. We have heard testimony from both sides, and now we move on. Permission to ask a question, Your Honor. Mr. Morris spoke again. Permission granted, nodded Fudge with obvious irritation. We've already figured out why the honorable members of the Wizengamot are meeting in full, but what does Mr. Maximilian Knight have to do with this case? He has a direct relation to this, Mr. Morris. Have you not read the requested materials of the case? I'm sorry, Your Honor, but the request was filed only a few hours ago, as was the application itself. My clients, like myself, couldn't even expect such a quick review of such an ordinary case. This is not a Wizengamot problem, Mr. Morris, Fudge said as if cut off. And Mr. Knight is here as Miss Granger's mentor, responsible for the mentoring contract. And yes, anticipating your next completely pointless question, Mr. Knight holds the minimum rank of apprentice for a valid mentoring contract, and was granted apprentice status himself almost immediately after the Three Wizards tournament, which, dare I remind you, he won. No further questions, Your Honor, Mr. Morris nodded. Though he tried to keep a face, he was clearly angry at the lack of information. After all, a quick response was the right decision. Otherwise, their strategy could have been completely different. In that case, since no one else has any questions about the testimony of the defendants in the case, let's proceed directly to the materials provided, Fudge summed up, and Mr. Morris was surprised again. There were quiet, disgruntled whispers behind us, too, but they blended into an unintelligible cacophony of sounds. Bring in the projection pensieve, said Fudge loudly, and two Aurors moved from the second exit, carrying between them a rather large, and unlike what stands in Dumbledore's office, a big basin. After carrying the pensieve to the center, the Aurors let it go, leaving it to levitate above the floor. Next, a man in a grey robe without any insignia entered the hall, and you couldn't see anything under his hood. This time it was Amelia Bones who spoke, giving an icy note to her voice. At the request of Mr. Goober, the lawyer of Mr. Knight and Miss Granger, an examination of the memoirs attached to the case materials was carried out. A wave of outrage, incomprehension, and indignation swept through the hall, and Fudge tapped his gavel loudly a couple of times. Silence! He shouted. Permission to speak, Your Honor. Mr. Morris interrupted the process once again, causing another slight irritation of Fudge. What's the point of that? Memories aren't proof, are they? Why should we consider them? They are not proof, certainly, nodded Fudge in agreement. They are, however, a reason to look for new evidence and testimony. With veritaserum, for example. Another wave of indignation swept through the hall, and the parents of the Slytherins shouted loudly, You can't. They're just kids. Of course, Fudge continued with a soft smile, strictly with the permission of their parents or guardians. However, it should be borne in mind that the refusal to testify under a veritaserum, and if there is a reasonable reason for such a requirement on the part of the Wizengamot, should be regarded as agreement with all the charges. The hall fell silent. If, the minister continued, in the course of reviewing the memories provided by Miss Granger, Miss Astoria, and Daphne Greengrass, a reason for questioning the others, as well as the misses themselves, through veritaserum, the honorable members of Wizengamot, just like me, in the person of Chief Warlock, we hope that there is no point for the defendants in the case to refuse if the charges they are accused of are lies, isn't it? Apparently, Mr. Morris has decided to back off for now. An unknown man in a grey robe took out bottles of memories from the inner pockets of his robe. 4 of them. One by one, he poured them into the pensieve, and it glowed with a soft blue light. The light in the courtroom became less bright, and a misty cloud began to grow rapidly over the pensieve, following the gestures of the unexpectedly removed wand of the man in grey, quickly occupying a couple of dozen cubic meters of space. It was in this cloud that the girl's memories began to spin, pictures replaced each other, sounds spread through the courtroom, and at Fudge's behest, the man in the grey robe would sometimes rewind them to the right moment and allow a detailed look at what was needed. After reviewing the girl's memories, Fudge spoke up. The memoirs of a witness who wished to remain anonymous are attached to the case materials. However, in order to understand the overall picture, they should also be considered. The minister nodded to the man in the grey robe, and he performed another gesture with a wand, and in the fog over the pensieve, my memories of the Slytherin conversation in a separate office were already spinning, whereof the important ones were mentions of the Dark Lord and his errands, along with Nott's confession that he had put an imperio on Daphne. Any objections? Fudge addressed everyone present. Petitions? Anything else? As I said earlier, the Slytherin lawyer stood up. Memories are not evidence of guilt or innocence, and therefore they cannot be considered as such. Very well, nodded Fudge. The Slytherin lawyer sat down. Somehow everything is going quietly, and I was expecting a more lively discussion. But here, perhaps, the lack of preparation on the part of the Slytherins and the expectation of a completely different approach to a case on the part of the Wizengamot is working for us. In a good way, there is nothing much to oppose to the material provided, as well as to the testimony, and if Fudge were to go only on the side of the law, then everyone would just walk away, innocent of the charges. Chapter 382. I submit for consideration, said Fudge, attracting the attention of those present and thereby stopping various whispers, the question of the validity of the spells used by Miss Granger, Miss Astoria, and Daphne Greengrass. The head of the DMLE, Amelia Bones, I ask you to voice the expert opinion of the DMLE on the spells used. Amelia Bones stood up, holding a parchment in her hands, and from it began to read the text. Based on the examination of the wands of the above-mentioned witches, certified by Hogwarts headmaster Albus Dumbledore, lawyer Eric Goober, and master of healing magic Poppy Pomfrey, along with a pre-trial examination. At this point, I looked at Hermione questioningly. The orders came by this morning after practice while you were still studying, Hermione whispered quietly back to me. Experts of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement have established that the spells used are defensive and defensive-offensive of the elementary and intermediate levels. Curses and dark magic are not detected. However, through priori incantatum applied to Miss Hermione Granger's wand, it was not possible to restore the full picture of the magical battle. The satisfied faces of the Slytherins I could literally feel in the back of my head. Due to the fact that during the fight, Miss Granger used 47 spells, and priori incantatum can identify only the last 20. However, due to the complete correspondence of the manifested spells with what is shown in the memories, it is acceptable to assume that the rest of the spells are exactly what is shown in the memories. The DMLE only has a question about the spells with a visual manifestation in the form of black matter. I ask for clarification from Miss Granger. Hermione, holding her head proudly the whole time, grinned. Space transfiguration, which my mentor taught me. The hall murmured quietly again, causing Fudge to bang his gavel. Silence. Or I will be forced to ask you to leave the room. Miss Granger, could you demonstrate them for an unambiguous conclusion by experts and members of the Wizengamot? Of course, Hermione nodded. Taking out the wand, she, with a light wave, literally grew a completely black footstool from the floor, which she used for its intended purpose. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Narcissa, who was holding an unfamiliar witch by the hand with an effort and, it seems, even threw silencio on her. Transfiguration, the pair of Wizengamot members nodded quietly. Thank you, Miss Granger, Fudge said neutrally and wanted to continue but just looked at Hermione. You may dispel the object for demonstration. Hermione, who had folded her outstretched legs on the stand, shrugged and dispelled it with a gesture. I ask the Deputy Minister of Magic of England to explain to us what the law says about the spells used and the situation. Now Umbridge rose from her seat while Amelia Bones sat down. Ahem, coughed this lady, again all in pink, starting to speak in her exclusive nasty manner. Given the multiple numerical advantage on the part of the opposing side, the Ministry of Magic can unequivocally interpret the spells used, their quality and quantity, as permissible for self-defense in a situation that jeopardizes the honor, health, and life of the witch, as well as for opposing, of course, dark magic in the face of both unforgiving spells and, judging by the memories, possibly included in the list, permissible for use by certified and current specialists, which are employees of St. Mungo's Hospital. And as we know, all the defendants in the current case are not such specialists. Objection, said Mr. Morris. The use of dark magic by my wards is unproven, as, again, memories are not proof. Accepted. In that case, Fudge continued much more calmly. I ask everyone to read Appendix number 6 on this case. These are the Veritas certified results of the healing diagnostics carried out by Madame Pomfrey immediately upon the defendant's admission in the case to the hospital wing of Hogwarts. The documents are true, confirmed by the seal of Veritas, held by a member of the Wizengamot. I couldn't help but grin as soon as I quickly looked around at those sitting on the sides and behind my back, and among the whispers that immediately rose, I managed to isolate, we destroyed them. How? It's interesting, and judging by Dumbledore's eyes, which for a moment glanced towards the source of this whisper, he is also extremely interested in all this. In the diagnostic data provided, Fudge was saying meanwhile, the injuries received by each are clearly indicated, among which, on the part of Slytherin students, bruises, abrasions, and fractures are included, and Miss Daphne Greengrass has traces of the rough influence of Imperio. It was the early diagnosis that made it possible to identify these traces. These data make me want to ask a fair question: why do Slytherin students look like they have just returned from the war, while memories, witness statements, and Veritas certified documents say that they should look absolutely healthy? If your clients do not take Skelgro to recover, this is their personal problems, as well as their personal disregard for their health, which we have no right to blame on Miss Granger, Miss Astoria, and Daphne Greengrass. What I personally don't understand, looking at everything that's going on, is what were they counting on without powerful preparation? It doesn't make any sense. So, please begin voting. Chapter 383. First, there was the question of Hermione's guilt in the charges against her, then Daphne, and then Astoria. No one was willing to frame themselves in the situation and vote that they were guilty. This was followed by a discussion of guilt and the degree of this guilt in relation to the rest of the Slytherins. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were acquitted due to the fact that they did not want any violence, and they didn't use many spells. They were saved by the lack of skills from the verdict. Many got off with a fine, as they applied the minimum and refused the Veritaserum. Nott and Selwyn also refused such an honor, but when their sentence was about to be announced, it was clear to everyone what the consequences of using the unforgivable were. Objection. A slightly unhinged dark-haired man of medium build, a little over 50 years old, jumped up from his seat. I don't agree with my son's guilt. Mr. Selwyn. Fudge tapped his gavel rather aggressively on the table. Please remain calm. Mordred to you, not calmness. The man ran into the middle of the hall, looking at the members of the Wizengamot. The Aurors moved but did nothing yet. This is all a crazy farce, and I, as the head of the Selwyn house, call. Who is there defending this? Muggleborn, to a duel of honor. Selwyn pointed his finger at me in a rude manner. The hall murmured, the members of the Wizengamot whispered, and cheers of approval ran through the audience and the Slytherin parents. As I recall, smirked Fudge, you, Mr. Selwyn, have only reached the rank of apprentice in various disciplines, have you not? Indeed I have. The man continued indignantly. And this one, he pointed his finger at me again. However, Fudge interrupted him, and Selwyn stared at him with question and indignation. You can only challenge a member of the Wizengamot on condition of equal status and achievement. Simply put, you have no right to challenge Mr. Knight to an honor duel. Why all of a sudden? The man got angry, but he didn't make any sudden moves. The Aurors don't sleep. An apprentice suddenly can't challenge another. Mr. Knight, Fudge looked at me. Rising from my seat, I took a step toward Selwyn, who immediately turned toward me. Holding out my hand with the Ouroboros ring, I smiled. Allow me to introduce myself, Master of Transfiguration, Maximilian Knight. And whom do I have the pleasure of speaking to? The sneer in my voice could have been scooped up by buckets, and there was silence in the hall. Selwyn was snuffling angrily, but he managed to control himself and returned to his seat, and I turned to the Wizengamot. May I address, Your Honor? Yes, Mr. Knight, nodded Fudge. Regarding the month of imprisonment in Azkaban for Mr. Nott and Mr. Selwyn. As you may have seen from the memories, Mr. Theodore Knott Jr. clearly has mental abnormalities. In this case, imprisonment even for a few days in Azkaban will lead to an irretrievable loss of adequacy. We, in turn, will lose the opportunity to return Mr. Knott to society. And what do you suggest? Umbridge asked, somehow even smiling insidiously. I suggest that Mr. Knott undergo a mental health check at Mungo and, if necessary, undergo a full course of treatment and rehabilitation in the appropriate department. The whole point of this proposal is that an appropriate attitude is needed for the use of dark magic. Either to clearly control emotions or to have an unstable psyche in order to sharply and powerfully disrupt it in the right direction. Of course, the first is extremely difficult, and the second is achieved by itself due to the peculiarities of dark magic. It is precisely that magic, which is based on sharp and vivid negative emotions, forcing the nervous system to stimulate the body to produce magic in a special mode, and the psyche to compose cruel mental images. Forced stabilization of the psyche will close the road to this power practically 100% because after that, it is extremely difficult to learn how to evoke the necessary emotional state under control. Even if you succeed, there is a great chance to go crazy completely and irrevocably. And as you know, rabid dogs are shot. Perhaps, Fudge spoke up. You would like to commute the sentence for Mr. Selwyn as well? No. He showed no signs of instability and acted, by all appearances, clearly aware of his actions and risks. I returned to my seat, and Fudge initiated another vote in which Knott was sent to Mungo. Selwyn was expelled from Hogwarts and sentenced to a month in Azkaban for using unforgivable spells. Not for long, because his sentence was very, very noticeably shortened for being a minor. In general, the hearing was somehow dull, and my preliminary and comprehensive preparation literally killed all interest. From the outside, it might seem that the lawyers practically didn't work, but I must give credit to Mr. Goober, who put all the documentation and materials in order, including building the wording of the charges, as well as the procedure for considering them by the members of the Wizengamot. Mr. Morris must have done some work as well, but, as I found out, both he and the Slytherins were counting on very different progress of the case, as was the composition of the Wizengamot. Chapter 384. Hermione and I left the hall in the company of Dumbledore and Mr. Goober, with Lady Greengrass and her daughters one step behind us. I must admit, the headmaster spoke as we walked down the corridors, passing other wizards looking suspiciously at Dumbledore. I was somewhat surprised and in some ways pleased by your decision regarding Mr. Knott. I was merely expressing an opinion, the reasons for which are quite obvious, and it is commendable that you are in no hurry to send anyone to the Dementors. Perhaps once rehabilitated, Mr. Knott can regain his sanity. Passing by the turn into another corridor, we witnessed an interesting scene of communication between Selwyn and his father, surrounded by Auror's escort. These two were covered by the charms of privacy, but you could easily read from the boy's lips the angry, "You recommended it yourself, and now you can't get me out." The answer was only, "Don't worry, son." Interesting. We had to go the other way, so we walked past. When we reached the atrium, Dumbledore waved his wand, creating a patroness, but it flew into the wall before it had time to form completely. "You may return to Hogwarts, young people. The address is Hogwarts, Hospital Wing." And I glanced at the headmaster. "I still have things to do at the ministry," the headmaster replied with a slight nod to himself, immediately turning around and leaving our company. Daphne and Astoria went to the fireplaces, quickly moving to the set address, while Lady Greengrass approached me, placing a simple silver chain in my hand. "Hurry up, the activator is standard," she said without explanation, but no explanation was needed. Delphine managed to step aside a couple of meters before Hermione immediately caught up with her, starting to talk about something while remembering to put privacy charms around them. I waited. The conversation didn't last more than a couple of minutes, and judging by the gestures, whatever Hermione was asking, she got an emphatic no, and then she came toward me. "Let's go," the girl's voice sounded displeased. We moved by the fireplace into the hospital wing of Hogwarts and found ourselves in a room filled in the sun's rays that was almost over the horizon. There were no visitors here now, and standing at the side was Madame Pomfrey, who waved her wand at the sight of us and touched the fireplace with it, seemingly blocking access. After greeting our healer, whom we saw in person for the first time today, Hermione and I went to the exit of the hospital wing, and as soon as we left the door, I immediately turned to the girl. "I have to go. I know. Be careful, she turned to me with a slight smile, giving me light and quick kiss. I turned around and walked quickly toward the exit of the castle, casting various concealing spells on myself at the same time. Now and then, in the corridors, there were groups of students of different ages, tired after a day of classes or happy that the day was gradually coming to an end. When I got outside the castle, I went to the border of the anti-apparition charms, and as soon as I went beyond it, I activated the chain portrait. I walked softly through space and found myself on the familiar ground in front of Lady Greengrass's wooden country mansion, which was already waiting for me on the doorstep, all in black and in a black robe with a hood. Seeing me, Delphine quickly walked up the stone-paved path. "We're going after the training material," she held out her hand to me, and as soon as I took it, we were pulled into the vortex of apparition. We were standing in the middle of a dark coniferous forest. The sky was already dark enough to see the stars and the light of the full moon on the rare clouds. If it weren't for the forest, it would be possible to see the moon itself, but it seems not today. My eyesight is good enough, and the cat's eye spell should not be applied. Bright flashes of a possible clash are not what I would like to see while under this spell. Delphine pulled out a small bag from under the hem of her robe and shook out about 24 large dark clumps of matter with one gesture. I felt around me a rather large movement of magic from Delphine to these clumps, the contours of which quickly swam, began to swell, inflate, turning into incomprehensible black creatures on 4 legs, with 3 long sharp tails, and the features of these creatures, as well as the size, inspired only one desire to run as fast as possible, and scream for help as loudly as possible. As soon as the Delphine took a step forward, these creatures scattered at great speed in a cone through the forest in the direction of Lady Greengrass movement. I followed her silently. "I invited you," Delphine said softly, "counting on your help. The ability to dispel defensive structures you've shown might come in handy." "Yes, and as support in case of an emergency. Breaking down defenses is that hard. Remember how much work it cost you to circumvent Dumbledore's simple age line. Of course, it was complicated, but nevertheless, it was just an age line. The protection of houses is much more complicated, more massive, and their breaking takes a very long time or breaks down by bare force. I am not a supporter of the extraction of power through rituals and sacrifices, and if there is an opportunity to get around this unpleasant nuance, then it should definitely be used. By the way, do wizards have nowhere else to take power from? What do you think?" We walked through the forest, stepping over tree roots, jumping over small ravines, and avoiding magically active areas and plants. "That's why," Delphine continued, "Professor Flitwick has been struggling with the creation of magic accumulator for years. And that's why sacrifice rituals appeared at the time. Without these rituals, the wizard has only one source of power himself." Chapter 385. There was a distinctive wolf howl in the distance, but Delphine didn't even move her head toward the sound, continuing on her way. I took my wand out of my holster, just in case. My hearing was quite sensitive, so I promptly reacted to the appearance of a hefty and shaggy werewolf from the side of the trees, which immediately rushed in our direction. 2 more appeared from the other side. I didn't stop but instantly pointed my wand, which was about to form the outline of a spell, and said, "Cumilaris." The blob of swirling deformed space was fast, even for me. It overtook the werewolf, who was about to dodge almost instantly, tearing him into many pieces and splashing blood, throwing them back, and twisting them in a spiral. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed how Delphine instantly threw an imperceptibly fast blob of matter from the tip of her wand, which pierced the chest of the second werewolf rushing at us. At the same moment, thin spikes literally grew out of his body, as if a Morgenstern appeared in the werewolf's chest. The spikes shifted several times quickly, slicing the werewolf's flesh into many small pieces that crumbled along the trajectory of his movement. We hit the third werewolf simultaneously, which caused it to simply be scattered in a bloody mess. And if you used the abilities of the architect, then no one within 100 meters would be a surprise to you. I didn't think of that. "Will you give me a hand already?" And along with Rowena's words, I felt a slight outflow of magic, along with which came a vague awareness of the space around us. We walked on quietly as if nothing had happened. "Where did the werewolves come from?" I asked Delphine in a quiet voice. It has long been rumored that one branch of the Selwyn family has been practicing forced transformation into a werewolf even without the influence of the moon. "Themselves? No, of course not. Anyone at all. As watchdogs. The technology is unknown, but apparently, it works. No family will allow a free pack to walk around in the immediate vicinity of their home. In the night darkness of the forest, we reached a small empty clearing, on which there was only bare ground. It's the middle of November, the grass has withered, the ferns have darkened, but even so, there should have been vegetation here. Here we are. The mansion is here. Delphine stood at the very edge of the woods, like me, hiding in the shadows without any magic, so that if I hadn't known of her presence, I would have spent a long time trying to see anything at all. Fidelius. No. Fidelius feels different. During my trips to Asia, I have encountered hidden spaces many times. It's just a strong disguise here. True light and dark magic have a lot in common: consciousness, emotions, worldview. The trustworthy charm got its name for a reason. She didn't say more, and I listened to the magic around me. It is only necessary to take a step forward, and you will immediately fall under the influence of magic fields, screens, and charms that are not very clear to me. Not far away, the howl was heard again, immediately choked. It seems that black creatures don't waste any time either. Lady Greengrass pulled something out again from under the hem of her robe. Once you remove the protection, I'll put up anti-apparition barriers and other movement blockages. Combat apparition will remain, but slowly. I nodded, hoping the gesture would be noticed, and focused again, releasing hemamancy energy around me. Like smoke, it began to spread through the strange dome of protection without disturbing it. And how did I do that after that ritual just cut through the protection? Indeed. I stretched out my hand and touched the invisible dome of protection with a finger wrapped in hemamancy energy, abruptly throwing this energy into space, forming a thin and high vertical red line on the rainbow dome that immediately appeared. A volitional effort, and the line widens to a passage of several meters, through which one could now see a large stone mansion with tall windows. Lady Greengrass immediately slipped inside, and once under the dome, she quickly stuck what she was holding in her hands into the ground. I also went under protection, feeling a sharp change in magic. You can't apparate. These feelings were much brighter than those within Hogwarts. That's it. Now act very quickly. The golems won't let them escape on their own 2 feet. Delphine moved towards the mansion, gaining a completely inhuman speed from the spot, and I had to speed up to keep up with her. Delphine waved her wand, and the front door was literally smashed in, along with part of the wall, tearing it to splinters. As soon as we literally flew into the resulting opening, a house elf appeared to my left. In true. He didn't have time to finish his sentence because of my Seiko, and the house elf split in 2. Cover me, Delphine said sharply, getting down on one knee and leaning her palm against the floor. Instantly being next to her, I pointed my wand to the ceiling, from where a crazy wild swarm of small, bat-like creatures began to fly in, which looked dangerous. Without thinking twice, I drew a circle around us with a wand, and as soon as it closed, a blue flame immediately grew from the floor, the wall of which seemed to be trying to close with a dome above us. Protego Diabolica worked like a clock, and thoughtlessly trying to fly creatures immediately burned to ash. Those who tried to fly through the upper point of the imaginary dome, unprotected by the flame, were knocked down by clumps of this very flame that burst out of the wall. There were so many creatures that the air above us and around us was strewn with ash that didn't have time to disappear. But it didn't last long, only a dozen seconds. Chapter 386. When everything was quiet, and only the Diabolica's flame hummed softly, flooding the hall of the house with an otherworldly blue light, Delphine got up from her knees and examined my creation. Radical, but effective. I know where to go. Put it out. With a wave of my wand, I extinguished the spell and followed Delphine, again moving quickly through the corridors of the house. Several times, on the move, we overloaded areas of the floor and walls with trap charms, simply launching energy-intensive spells into them or breaking the very surface to which the charms were attached. In less than half a minute, we found ourselves in a 2-level hall, along which a man I knew was running away from us. After checking everything with shadow and magic, I found nothing worthy of attention, and together with Delphine, we abruptly rushed after the man. But the strange thing is, he managed to cover the rest of the hall, after which he turned to us and grinned. It was as suspicious as possible. We stopped abruptly, creating a whole bunch of different shield charms from everything in a row, simultaneously strengthening it. As it turned out, it was not in vain. A second, that was how long it took before powerful concentrated streams of magic, clearly carrying some sort of spell or curse, struck us from 4 directions. These dark blue beams struck the shields we'd created, knocking out blinding flashes of bright sparks. The attack lasted only a moment, and when it subsided, as well as the flow of magic from it, we were already standing in a well-lit stone hall without any special decorations, in the middle of a powerful force screen the size of the entire hall. On the second level of the hall, 16 assorted wizards were standing around us behind the railing. Delphine, after a quick look around, turned to me. "Buy me 5 seconds." But I could see from the faces of the wizards surrounding us that they were going to mock us, not attack us. And I also found a lot of doors in the walls of the hall suspicious, and what is important, they weren't affected by the force magic field. Having launched the architect's ability, which, to my joy, worked perfectly, I found behind each of the doors a hefty werewolf on chains and with foam at the mouth. The shadow was able to get out of the field, but I immediately returned everything as it is. "What if they find out that it works? Let me take it from here," I whispered quietly to the Delphine standing beside me. "It's not just your revenge. How much material do you need?" "1. Selwyn." Well, spoke Selwyn, already standing on the second floor of the hall and looking up at us, leaning against the railing. "Who do we have here? What am I talking about? It's like I didn't know you were coming, Delphine." The dark-haired man chuckled, and the others echoed him but stopped at a hand gesture. "By the way, not likely, of course, but do you know where my faithful comrades have gone? Jugsun, for example?" "No." "You'll meet soon," Delphine replied calmly, throwing a couple of simple spells at the barrier with her wand to see the exact reaction of the magic. "You don't have to try, you won't get out of there. It's an old family trick to restrain recalcitrant wizards. If you only knew how those pathetic muggles we let in to feed this creation screamed." The wizards around him laughed again, but they fell silent, as before, at Selwyn's hand gesture. He unzipped his robe, revealing his leather camping suit for a moment, and pulled a small cube from the pouch on his belt. "The Dark Lord does not tolerate refusals, as well as failures, and he is always merciful to those who fulfill his will. My son," Selwyn glanced at me, "because of you, brat, who ended up in Azkaban won't stay there long. Your last words." Selwyn pressed the edge of the cube, and the doors in the walls abruptly opened, revealing werewolves on chains. When they saw the prey, they immediately went wild, pulling these chains with a clang, but they withstood, keeping the distraught creatures in place. Trying to feel the magic, I found a powerful and crazy saturated ritual structure under our feet, but it was not there until the moment of activation. In fact, neither were the wizards around. It's worth paying attention to such things in the future. Literally creating a blade of blood under the heel, I made my way through the floor with it to the very contour of the ritual, starting to fill it and preparing to absorb magic according to the scheme remembered by Rowena back in my state of disordered consciousness. "If anything, mine are ready to attack right now," Delphine whispered, giving me the helm of the operation, so to speak. It seems that the pretentious villain is waking up in me again. Chapter 387. Your last words. Selwyn stood on the second floor of the hall, looking at these losers and preparing to activate the amulet at any moment to release the werewolves from their chains. In a closed room, a very rare wizard can stand against 12 such creatures. Especially such modified, improved ones. How glad Selwyn was when he found out about the Dark Lord's displeasure with Malfoy's offspring. Now there is an opportunity to displace the cheeky son of an equally cheeky, but dead dad. And now that the Dark Lord is assured that Greengrass will not come to his side because of Malfoy's mistake, he has ordered the elimination of the older generation. You can't get to the old Greengrass, but killing the girl is like taking candy from a muggle. The guy downstairs. He has style. It's even a pity that we have to kill such a talented guy. He could serve the Selwyns and the Dark Lord well. Obviously, he did not disdain body training, unlike many. For a moment, Selwyn remembered his younger years and the fact that he looked nothing like Knight, shallow, thin, but pure blood and strong. You think, the guy below spoke up, looking around at everyone present, that you're safe behind the barrier. It's only an illusion. A reassuring delusion, supposedly protecting you. Enjoy your last moments of life, for I have come to exact my vengeance. Selwyn wanted to laugh, but something told him to activate the amulet. 12 huge werewolves broke out of the pens, rushing at the two wizards in the middle of the hall with unprecedented speed. Selwyn was already in anticipation of their screams, but Knight only lazily waved his hand with a wand, pointing to the ceiling, and a cloud of hundreds of thousands of bloody strings seemed to rise around him and the green grass girl, in the blink of an eye, turning the 12 werewolves into bloody pulp that rolled down at the feet of the two. Problem. And how are you going to take revenge? Selwyn exclaimed in a less confident voice, addressing the two wizards under the barrier. And to whom the Dark Lord? I've made this barrier impenetrable, and even if you get out, you'll have to go through us first. You did. So much arrogance and mockery were in the voice of the damned blonde that Selwyn grimaced at how much it hurt him. You have no idea what you've done. The guy's eyes lit up with a faint blue light. I will step over your cold corpses. The barrier surrounding Greengrass and Knight trembled. Subordinates, personally issued by the Dark Lord, took out their wands, preparing to fight back. Suddenly, a lot of black circles of different sizes appeared all over the hall, just hanging in space. One circle, no bigger than a saucer, appeared in front of Knight, and he pointed his wand at it. The sense of danger sounded the alarm, and Selwyn put the most powerful protego around him. Shall we start? Knight asked, quickly whispering a spell. Selwyn could not help but recognize the humming jet of crimson fiend fire that struck the black circle in front of Knight, but Selwyn was shocked by something else. Flames burst out of all such circles around the hall in different directions, immediately merging into powerful streams, sweeping away the protection of other Death Eaters, incinerating them, walls, decorative elements. Selwyn watched with wide-open eyes as if time had slowed down, allowing him to see how the world was melting into ever-changing nightmarish images of crimson flames, uncontrollably devouring everything around, merging into one ring. Run! Was the only thought in Selwyn's head, and his body hastened to realize it itself. He turned around and ran, and even the doors, to which a second ago he was standing with his back, opened in a direction not provided for by design. He ran through the corridors without remembering himself, leaving behind the last death cries of the horror of his newly found comrades and the hum of fiend fire. After running through a couple of corridors, Selwyn found the courage to turn around, but only to jump out of the window at the sight of Knight and Greengrass calmly following him. Out of fear, he forgot how to conjure, and the heartbeats merged into a monotonous hum in his ears. Selwyn ran into the woods, but when he turned around, he saw Knight and Greengrass again. The saving border of the anti-apparition barrier was felt very close. It seemed that you only needed to stretch out your hand, but black creatures the size of a bear jumped out of the forest. Selwyn didn't see how the same creatures were now leaving his house, walking calmly toward Greengrass following Knight. Avada Kedavra! Shouted Selwyn, pointing his wand at one of the creatures, but the powerful green beam of the killing curse did nothing to it. Someone grabbed Selwyn by the back. From a sharp jerk back, the whole world turned upside down in his eyes. There was no wand in his hands. Knight stepped on his chest from above, bending down and looking straight into his face. Selwyn tried to conjure something, but to his horror, he realized that he couldn't, looking into the burning blue eyes. Ha ha ha! The wizard lying with his back to the ground burst out in a fit of hysterical laughter. You can't win! Ha ha ha! Can't escape! The Dark Lord is great and mighty. Knight spoke calmly and harshly. Better. Ha ha ha. In what? In everything. The world faded for Selwyn, and the phrase, as if through the thickness of water, reached the consciousness fading under the influence of spells. I went a little too far with the cold corpses. Chapter 388. The silence of the cold November night was a balm to my ears, and the star-studded sky, so unfamiliar to city dwellers, added a touch of mysticism to the destruction of the Selwyn mansion. Well, the destruction itself hadn't started yet, but it was about to. Couldn't we? I spoke up as soon as Delphine transfigured Selwyn himself into a small iron ball, to somehow rob or something. We don't know, Delphine replied, packing up the golems that had returned to the state of dark clots, whether the alarm has been triggered. We may have a minimum of time. We can't take anything ourselves, and we won't give it to others. And if there was no alarm? You want to risk it for what the best is the enemy of the good. Delphine pointed her wand toward the mansion and made a couple of small gestures. The house shuddered, then again. And after a couple of seconds, it began to crease toward its center, to where there was a hall with a trap on us. It looked like there was a black hole, and invisible hands were literally crumbling the walls of the house into that point. After a couple of seconds, only a flat pit remained from the mansion, in the shape of which the foundation with basement rooms was guessed. What was that? I looked at Delphine with sincere curiosity. You might say it was a complex ritual for quickly demolishing old buildings, staged with the help of golems. Delphine held out her hand to me, and as soon as I took it, she immediately apparat to a place unknown to me among the rocks, and the surf was roaring behind. I turned around at the very edge of the cliff and saw the sea surface, in which the light of the full moon was reflected in a multitude of reflections. Lady Greengrass approached the steep cliff in front of which we stood, and touching certain parts of it with her wand, whispering something in passing, opened a passage whose mechanisms were similar to those that led to the Diagon Alley. As soon as the passage opened, Delphine waved her hand at me, and she threw a lumos from a wand into the passage, which hovered there, under the low arch of the walls. Well, relatively low. Stepping after Delphine into this passage with a triangular arch of walls, I heard the entrance close behind us, and now only the lumos illuminated a long stone corridor. Running my fingertips along the sloping wall, I felt a slight matte coating, and the treatment was clearly very smooth, not of a natural type. Although, what's surprising about that, I didn't make them too smooth so that there was no mirror effect. Lady Greengrass anticipated all my questions without looking at me. I prepared this place specifically for practical training in healing magic. Specially. Yes. We were still walking along the corridor in the rock, and there were weak and incomprehensible currents of magic around us. As I said, there's not much to understand without practice in this area. You can get it in the hospitals where your mentor works, in the guild, by paying a certain amount, and in other official ways that impose either costs or obligations, or both. In our case, we can take the more practical and convenient route since the Dark Lord, and his minions are beginning to be active, and there will soon be even more material. Quite a tough approach. We stopped. It appeared that the corridor had come to an end. Delphine put her hand against the wall, and a blue triangle with 3 circles at the tops glowed at the point of contact. A new passageway formed in the wall, beyond which was a completely empty hall. As soon as we stepped inside, the light in the hall came on, and I was able to look around. The room was indeed large, in the shape of a hexagon, the vaulted ceiling of which consisted of successive triangles. It was they who emitted a soft bluish light, but its total volume was enough for very good lighting, bright, but not blinding at all. In the wall opposite the entrance was another passageway, and in the 2 on the left and right were ledges, as if for consoles or shelves for tools. Over there, Delphine pointed to the walls on the left and right. Workplaces. I'll explain later. Let's go to the freezer. Following Delphine crossing the hall, I entered the only passage other than the entrance and found myself in the hall, the light in which was also blue, illuminating the rows of small round platforms. Only 2 of them were occupied, and above them, steel balls were levitating in an almost invisible blue column of light. Stasis platforms, Delphine explained and walked over to one of the unoccupied artifacts, taking a steel ball out from under the hem of her robe, tossing it over the platform. Autonomous and work on the crumbs of magic from a transfigured magical being placed in the area of influence. Even in this form I pointed to the ball hanging above the platform. Of course. Don't you, when you transfigure yourself, retain the ability to do magic? It's the same here, just in a smaller amount, but enough to maintain the charms. And everything else? A little from here, a little from the wizards present within the premises. An absolute minimum, but enough. I see. You won't get in here yourself, so I'll be picking you up for classes myself. Port Kayat. Excluded for security reasons. Only self-destructive, only under my control. Delphine turned and headed for the exit of the freezer, and I followed her. There's too much magic applied here, she continued as we crossed the hexagonal hall, that I'm not allowed to apply. Of course, things like the Port Kayat, and even if it had the most unpredictable word activator, can still bring undesirable personalities here. We left this makeshift secret bunker, and Delphine apparat us near Hogwarts, and after saying goodbye to me, she apparat back to her business. There was only one thing left for me to return to the castle. Chapter 389. Once again, as before, Completely hidden from possible surveillance, I made my way into the castle, into the common room, where, at this late hour, there was no one there but Hermione sitting on our couch. She was once again making notes in her notebook, not paying attention to anything, but as soon as I went in her direction and took off the spell, the girl immediately noticed me, smiled, and patted the couch next to her. I did not refuse the invitation. As soon as I threw off my bag and coat, as I immediately found myself on the couch, but not sitting, but lying down, resting my head on her lap. "How did go?" Hermione asked, putting the notebook aside. "Good. Got the study material." "Material, if I understand correctly, it's somewhat atypical material." "Exactly. Were there any problems?" "The animal turned out to be gregarious, and as you know, when this kind of animal gets into packs, they suddenly start thinking they're predators. I hope their delusions didn't cause any problems." "Not a bit. I wish I could say that the effect of an exploding bomb was produced by the unscheduled issue of the Daily Prophet, the reason for the premature release of which was an article by Rita Skeeter about the trial, but no. The reason for this is simple. Rumors appeared on Monday morning, the cause of which were children whose parents or relatives are connected with office work within the ministry or even the DMLE. These rumors were multiplied by an article about the miraculously escaped Skeeter. Many wondered, who, when, whom, and how did it end, and a rare student compared the facts, or rather, the composition and numbers of conflicting groups of students, among whom, for obvious reasons, the younger ones were excluded. So those few had a picture: Max Knight and Hermione Granger against Draco Malfoy with his minions. For this reason, these few people, who can be counted on the fingers of two hands, did not look surprised at all at breakfast on Tuesday, when the owl mail bombarded the students with a flood of correspondence. As soon as the students learned the participants' identities, the Slytherins were literally physically bombarded with a stream of stares full of contempt or mockery. Or something else. Hermione, on the other hand, was looked at in amazement, but within a minute, you could hear, "I knew it." Or, "There's a reason they're always studying somewhere." That was the general message. But, of course, it wasn't without Ron Weasley. If only I'd been there," he lamented indignantly, and everyone around him was glad he'd chewed his food first. "If I'd been there, ugh! I'd have dealt with them." It was also interesting that several of the magic photos in the article showed a looped 5 or 6 seconds of Hermione's fight against everyone. Of course, it should be borne in mind that those captured in magical photos may behave somewhat differently than in reality. When printed, they can even create the illusion of a meaningful response to external stimuli, for example, if you poke a photo with your finger. But I can't deny the excellent selection of shots from Rita, and in these frames, the whole meaning of memories was contained. Hermione scatters her opponents as quickly and efficiently as possible, showering them with various spells like a machine gun, alternating her attack with Protego and periodically dodging in dance moves. The result of the appearance of such a photo is admiration, envy, and who knows what else. Personally, I was worried about Umbridge being too pleased. I don't think she's really bad or evil, no. She just didn't give a damn about anyone, going forward in her career and arranging her future to the best of her ability. However, I had already figured out that a contented Umbridge was to unexpected and unpleasant innovations. Noticing a happy Umbridge, I walked around all day, expecting a catch and at the same time thinking about the education system because these are interrelated issues. For example, the innovations introduced by the ministry through Umbridge, on the one hand, are not bad and are really designed not so much to improve as to systematize the knowledge obtained. Yes, the original purpose is to provoke us all, teachers and headmaster, but it is not without its positive side. But, this innovation and the most thoroughly worked out program have an obvious disadvantage, a violation of the usual and ingrained in the subcortex of the training regime. The lack of the opportunity to legally practice spells in the subject of quite severely affects the understanding of our successes in the field of magic and on self-confidence. But the work done by ministerial experts is tremendous, and the systematization of knowledge is excellent. If earlier many students had to dig through about 24 books for the sake of a grain of knowledge about several spells, now every spell is clearly written with every conceivable nuance. And again, there are both pros and cons in this. Pros: no need to stir up a mountain of books. Cons, in fact, are the same because one way or another, the grains of incidental knowledge seen and obtained during the search for the right one, a little, but they are deposited in the head. There are cons and pros everywhere. Chapter 390. In the evening, Hermione and I faced a real ordeal in the common room. To be exact, it was just her, but I didn't leave her side, so I got it too. Or should I say, didn't let her go. The essence of the problem is in everyone's attention. Too much well done, too much wow. A complete overdose from you didn't read books for nothing. Of course, some people were jealous, saying, she's so gifted, I wish I was. And I have already said that this is the result of training. But it seems that society is easier to write off on giftedness and envy than to recognize the fruits of labor. Such attention bored us on Tuesday, began to bore us on Wednesday, November 15th. As a result, a commander's decision was made, escape from Hogwarts for the evening. It didn't take long to prepare. At the end of the last class on the schedule, we immediately went to our rooms. After changing into casual clothes, at nightfall, long before dinner, we sneaked out safely under the complex charms of concealment from the castle. Where shall we go? A logical question arose as soon as we found ourselves outside the anti-apparition charms around the castle. Improvisation is like that. I have no idea. Then, I held out my hand to the girl. Let's go to London. Hermione took my hand firmly, and I carried us to a small nook on Shaftesbury Avenue. After spending a couple of moments adapting to the change of the silence of the surroundings of Hogwarts to the noise of one of the central streets of London, we took off the extra charms, leaving only a slight distraction, and walked straight out onto the walkway. The time when the evening sky begins to darken, and street lighting, on the contrary, turns on, I find the most interesting. Shop windows and signs shone invitingly and brightly. The designs of buildings of various eras and styles sharply contrasted with each other. Soho? Hermione asked, putting her hand on the crook of my elbow, and we just missed a group of people walking towards us, also looking around. Where else can you go if you need variety? Social, visual, and stuff like that. Indeed, smiled the girl and turned her head to the right, peering at the movie theater posters across the street. Strangely enough, I operate here from the memory of a past life. Surprisingly, this place is so fickle yet stable. Curzon. I remember visiting this movie theater once just for fun, and I ended up going only here for a couple of years. Something wrong? Hermione pulled me a little by the hand. No, I shook my head. Let's go. I didn't expect that such a sudden walk would be so interesting. Just walking around here and there, without any plan and preliminary analysis with calculations. When almost every step is unpredictable, and the desire to go to a shopping mall or sit in a good Chinese restaurant is the result of impulsiveness. It was fun to watch Hermione in a Chinese restaurant. Chopsticks are evil. But you just can't ignore and not try the Peking duck in a restaurant where it is considered almost the main dish. And I remember this place from that same past life. I'm about to start complaining about flashbacks. Another funny thing was that the not very nice round-faced waitress in the restaurant constantly forgot about our existence, looking at us with rapidly passing bewilderment, the set and half-empty table, and in general, probably highly doubtful about her mental health. When it got dark, we left such an interesting and unusual Chinatown in Soho, having bought a couple of bags of different teas, among which I was very happy to buy Tai Guanyin. In my time I liked to try and find oolong, which I would have liked so damn much. Now I'm wondering if this tea will still feel the same back on Shaftesbury Avenue. And walking past the Palace Theatre, I couldn't help but chuckle as I remembered the buzz around the cursed child. It was as if those yellow posters with the nest rose before my eyes. These memories also aroused some fears. What if this happens? Well, except for dark-skinned Hermione, her fair skin is a constant. When we passed by the Soho Baptist Chapel, which has not yet been given to the Chinese and is, in fact, a memorial chapel on the Gower, a conversation about future plans arose by itself. I don't know, Hermione shrugged, holding her hand in the crook of my elbow. The desire to remake everything around me struggles with the desire to study magic, invent something interesting. What about you? Always wanted to stay as far away from politics as possible. You're not so good at it. The girl grinned, fixing the collar of her coat with her free hand, which shuddered in the sudden gust of wind. Well, yes. I don't have many options. People are still people everywhere, always trying to cause trouble. Either you're strong enough, but nobody knows about it, and you constantly have to tell them how wrong they are by force, or you do it publicly, but then you start playing by the rules of society. I don't want too bad rumors circulating about my comrades or me, so I have to get into it. So you're thinking of doing something scientific, too? Not really. To learn magic. I want to describe it accurately from a scientific point of view one day, build it into the picture of the world. But for now, you see, you have to be strong. In fact, that's what I talked about on the train the first time we went to Hogwarts. Getting stronger, yes. After wandering through the still crowded streets of London, despite the late hour, we apparat to Hogwarts. Next time, to the cinema, Hermione nodded as we walked toward the castle. Because with all this magic, I'm starting to forget what a movie screen looks like. Okay, I smiled back, I'll have to show you the house where I live now sometime. Is that an invitation? The girl looked at me with some kind of playful expression on her face. For tea, and what are we going to do at your house? Read books, what else? I shrugged, hiding a smile. There's a great library there. Touché. Chapter 391. After our secret walk, it was easier to get over the excessive attention Hermione received from the other girls in the Gryffindor. At least they didn't bother from other houses but watched from a safe distance. The only girl left, in fact, besieging Hermione on a regular basis, now and then grabbing her under the elbow in a friendly way and trying to find out all the details, Lavender Brown. However, in response to questions like, how did they take a look, what exactly did they say, how did they say it, Hermione did not answer, or answered vaguely, because both she and I knew perfectly well how the Lavender Brown word of mouth works. Blondie will definitely build on the basis of what has been said completely unprecedented stories, intrigues, and events that allegedly led to what happened and what should happen next. In general, the complete lack of any reactions, both from Hermione and me and from the Slytherins, led to the gradual fading of gossip, even despite the non-triviality of the event. By Friday, such fame had ceased to be a problem. But, apart from that, another important event happened on Friday. More precisely, it all started on Thursday after the charms class. Professor Flitwick asked Hermione and me to come to him on Friday, as soon as we were free. So we did. Directly to his office, adjacent to the charms classroom in Ravenclaw Tower. After knocking on the door and waiting for an invitation, Hermione and I went inside. Professor Flitwick was sitting at his massive wooden desk, bogged down in a variety of different parchments, papers, and books, covered with a variety of calculations. Ah, Mr. Knight, Miss Granger. The professor looked up cheerfully at us, immediately beckoning with his hand. Come quickly. Closing the door behind us, we walked over to the desk, and Flitwick magically gathered the pile of various papers into one large stack with one motion of his hand. Here, the professor slid the stack in our direction. Here are some interesting assumptions for an idea that Miss Granger suggested to me about the multidimensional nature of space. Can we get more details? I leaned over the papers a little, beginning to flip through them, reading and memorizing at the same time. Oh! Absolutely. But not for long. As we've learned through so many experiments, almost all materials are equally capable of holding magic. Some are better, some worse, some let magic through more slowly, and some faster. This is no secret to us. Just as it's no secret that organic materials have the best properties. Miss Granger, on the other hand, has noted interesting things in some of her hypotheses, some properties of stasis charms, the classic anti-magic protogo, space expansion, and the possibility of recalculating them with the introduction of additional spatial dimensions into the equations or, conversely, their withdrawal. Hermione smiled and looked embarrassed, even if it wasn't much, and this reaction made me and the professor smile. It seems. The thoughts in my head were running at a tremendous speed. I have a hunch. I never doubted either of you, the professor smiled. Miss Granger pointed out that in the extension charm, you have to work with 3 spatial dimensions. It would seem that only on the basis of this you can already create an accumulator by simply expanding the space, but no. The area of the extension charm enchantment is magically isolated. Have you noticed that, for example, to lure the contents from such an area, at least the tip of the wand should be placed there. So we have to make the extension charm area such that it lets magic through. That's right, Mr. Knight. But at the same time, you should understand that it is not possible to expand the space inside a dense object without destroying matter. At least with the current calculations and notions of world order. Miss Granger, among other things, noticed that the stasis charm is very similar to the classic Protogo. But if the shield film has no thickness in principle, creating a visual illusion of it, then stasis is a volumetric field. Yes, I know that there may be a question about the shape of the film, it is three-dimensional, but we are now considering the thickness, which is an infinitesimal quantity. And the similarity of these spells and charms is that, even if not as a basis, they use an effect similar to. Professor Flitwick's speech was getting faster, and he himself was involuntarily making various gestures now and then as if trying to describe his vision with them. Our conversation with the professor dragged on for several hours, at the end of which it was clear that we still had a lot of work to do. Anyway, guys, the professor jumped out of his chair, approaching us. Let's think of a scheme and do the calculations. You, as I see it, came to the solution of some logical aspects pretty quickly. And then, we will calculate the whole thing together and try to experiment. Except. The professor drooped. We have to wait for Professor Umbridge to leave our school. Okay, Professor, we nodded with a smile. After picking up and putting the stack of papers in Hermione's bag, we headed out to dinner. I didn't need the calculations, they were already in my head. Chapter 392. The first Saturday after the storming, if you can call it that, of the Selwyn's house, began as usual, and the weather promised to be sunny. After all the standard procedures, training in the Chamber of Secrets, breakfast there, practicing spells, and a couple of tough but relatively safe duels, during which Hermione showed very good skills in transfiguration and spells, along the way, finally starting to accelerate slowly, we went to Hogsmeade. Lady Greengrass should be waiting for us at the strictly allotted time. How nice, Hermione said quietly as we made our way out of the castle. We got out, along with everyone, but not officially, so as not to be noted in the lists. What exactly? A qualitative leap in magic, she smiled. Now, I can react and conjure even faster. We had to hurry to get ahead of the bulk of the students, cheerfully rushing to Hogsmeade for their long-awaited vacation. Whoever needed to, of course, went there at any time they wanted, but this was official, and there was no need to hide. Miraculously, though, we managed to get to the Three Broomsticks among the first. Lady Greengrass was already sitting at the familiar table in yet another dark dress and hooded robe. Once again acknowledging her magic, I didn't hesitate to sit down and say hello, and Hermione, hesitating for a second, repeated my actions. Delphine waved her wand, and the space around us rippled for a moment, quite a strong spell of distraction and privacy. It's time, guys, to move on to practice in healing magic, but first, Delphine looked us over. I already know Max's opinion, but you, Hermione? Yes, almost imperceptible notes of anxiety cut through the girl's voice. You must understand that we can't practice legally and properly. Do you understand that? Yes. Then you must understand that we won't have ordinary patients, but test subjects. Exactly, smiled Delphine. And again, you have to understand that to practice medicine, you need properly traumatized test subjects. I understand. Which means, Delphine continued sternly, someone has to traumatize them, examine, diagnose, heal, and traumatize again, to consolidate your skills. And then move on to examining other traumas, curses, and stuff like that. I understand, Hermione nodded confidently. Well, then, Delphine placed a parchment on the table in front of Hermione. A non-disclosure contract. The girl, fixing a strand of hair, pulled the parchment towards her and for a long 2 minutes fell out of reality, studying it carefully. She nodded silently, and Delphine handed her the black quill. Hermione silently signed, getting a slight scratch on the back of her palm, and the scratch healed almost immediately. Good, Lady Greengrass nodded seriously, matching the situation, taking the contract. The distraction is tied to us, so let's go. It is extremely indecent to apparate from the establishment or move by a porte-caiette. We left the hospitable comfort of the Three Broomsticks, glancing briefly at the contingent of students of different ages filling it, starting from the 3rd year and older. After walking just a couple of meters and turning the corner of the establishment, Delphine handed us a silver chain. It seems that she prefers such items as porte-caiette. As soon as we took it up, Lady Greengrass said, Porteous, and we set off on a short but dizzying journey. A sharp gust of harsh sea wind slapped me in the face, and finding myself on a familiar rocky cliff, I held Hermione by the elbow, so she would not stumble from surprise. I'm cold-blooded, but what about her? How will she react to such a radical change of scenery? The bright and positive weather that had reigned over Hogwarts was gone. There was clearly going to be a storm here on the rocky coast. Delphine opened a triangular passage in the rock, and we followed her down the corridor I knew, lit by my lumos. When we reached the end of the corridor, Delphine opened another passageway, and we entered a hexagonal hall. "We'll work there." Waving her hand to the right side of the hall, Lady Greengrass quickly reached the wall behind which the freezer was located and disappeared into the darkness of the opening. For a couple of seconds, Hermione looked around with interest at the walls, the panels sticking out of them, as if for a keyboard or a stands for something. Her inspection did not avoid the vaulted ceiling, which consisted of triangles emitting a soft blue light. "What's there to work on?" she asked a reasonable question, but the answer came from an unexpected source. "Transfiguration," came the voice of Lady Greengrass quietly approaching from the side. "Are you wizards, or have I wasted so much time?" The unaccustomed severity in the manner of the conversation caused Hermione to shift her eyebrows thoughtfully, and I waved my wand immediately pulled out of the holster, creating a simple iron table. "Better a chair with arm and leg restraints," Delphine recommended coldly and shifted her gaze to Hermione. "We're not here for fun, so focus. There is no place for jokes and a caring attitude." Chapter 393. I converted the table into a dental chair, and Delphine waved her hand, sending a ball of metal from behind her back directly into the chair. At the moment of touching the back, the ball turned into a Jugsun. Business dark jacket, hair tied in a ponytail. With a wave of my wand, I made the arm and leg bindings snap together, fusing them together, and the rune chains to increase the strength of the material came through, which I immediately powered up with magic. Jugsun woke reluctantly, and when he blinked and looked us over, he yanked his arms and legs a couple of times, to no avail. With a smirk, he looked at Delphine. "And what would that mean?" "Jonathan Joseph Jugsun," Lady Greengrass put a chill in her voice. 28 uses of unforgivable curses have been officially confirmed, 7 of which are killing curses. All of the killing curses are successful. More than 20 incidents of violence of various kinds against wizards, both pure blood, half-blood and muggle-born, have been officially confirmed. The number of ordinary people tortured or killed is unknown, but definitely more than 5 dozen, he just can't remember any more. "Good to know," Jugsun grinned, turning his head a couple of times, causing a few grey strands on his head to ruffle. "That my file didn't get lost." Delphine silently threw silencio at him. "What do you think, Hermione?" The girl stood somewhat pale, and her completely emotionless face spoke of an occlumency turned to maximum. "Why a term in Azkaban and not a Dementor's kiss? They say everyone was put in Azkaban back then, and no one was sentenced to a kiss, regardless of the severity of the crime. Back then, that prison was considered one you couldn't escape from, and all of them." Delphine nodded toward Jugsun, who continued to grin, a frantic gleam appearing in his eyes. "They wanted to torture them as long as possible." "I see," Hermione nodded. "Where do we start?" "That was my line," I smiled, despite how it would look from the outside. "First, we'll learn a few diagnostic spells. 2 of them will allow you to conjure up illusory 3-dimensional graphs that show the parameters you mentally set, since you have a high level of knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and other allied disciplines of healing magic. The other 3 are not so much spells as methods of analyzing your magic, released in its purest form through your wand. There you need to analyze the peculiarities of the response in the stream. You have a theoretical basis on curses, dark magic, and other things, so you can supplement the results of the analysis by visual inspection of the damaged area, as well as other physical manifestations, quite well. Let's start with the banal and simple." Delphine pointed her wand at Jugsun, who twitched a couple of times again, but much harder. Sluguluzeructo. A faint, quick cloud of green flashed from the tip of Delphine's wand, landing directly on Jugsun's head. He began to turn pale and even blue, and a brief moment later, a huge slug fell out of his mouth and onto his chest. "Now, let's get to the diagnosis." Swings of the wand, corrections from Delphine, more swings, and verbal formulas. Along the way, we cleaned with the help of Slagulu's Evanesco. Jugsun tried a couple of times to conjure something non-verbally and without a wand, but only succeeded in getting Silencio off of him. He immediately began to shout out profanities at us in English and Spanish. However, they were often interspersed with the sounds of a puking cat, and Silencio was quickly put back down. In general, as I noticed, Delphine very clearly and continuously monitors the movement of magic around and keeps, as they say, finger on the pulse. So we diagnosed, studying the effects of the curse on the subject's magic, noting the mechanisms that trigger the process of the transfiguration of saliva into slugs. Having perfectly memorized, but not fully understood, the mechanisms of curses associated with the fixation on the body and transfiguration of bodily fluids through the magic invested by the creator, we switched to similar, but fueled by the magic of the victim, we forced the blood in hand to rot, but when leaving the hand to return to its original state. Then we moved on to the fixed ones on magic. Then to those that affect the body, giving false signals to tissues and organs, for example, making the person constantly defecate or dance uncontrollably. Of course, we also had to clean up the consequences of such magic, but it's good that not with our own hands. Curses became more complicated by the hour, and their treatment methods with counter-curses or their combination with potions became more sophisticated. After that, we switched to ordinary physical injuries. We studied how they affect the body and magic, simultaneously trying to track the peculiarities in changing the response from diagnostic charms. I especially liked the banal reducto performed by Delphine. A minimum of magic, no waving or words at all. Just a thin and not particularly bright ray hits the body. Still, its power is so great that it breaks all the bones in its path, turning the tissues into one big hematoma. The shock wave, spreading through the body, tears the mesentery on which the internal organs are attached. That's the experience along with the density of magic in the spell. I wonder how much an inanimate object will explode when hit by this spell performed by Delphine, or will the destruction go deeper? The final chord was an unremovable curse of rotting flesh. As Delphine threw a disgusting purple dark clod of curse at the lost, pointlessly looking somewhere in the distance Jugsun, the already horrible looking, sweaty and all bloody, but a whole wizard, began to turn sharply blue. His skin began to quickly become covered with scabs, and he began to dry up, then, on the contrary, to swell, twitching in severe convulsions and vomiting fits, flooding himself with pus and bile. His consciousness had long since left his body. "Examine," Delphine said quietly, constantly clearing the air with waves of her wand. Hermione's pallor could be compared to chalk, but due to a clemency, she continued to perform her tasks. I, on the other hand, was somehow indifferent. Chapter 394. As you can guess, Delphine was saying as we conjured over the slowly dying Death Eater. Vomiting is caused by avalanche intoxication of the body. Do not look at his visual torment. He's been unconscious for a long time, and his brain shut down almost immediately after the curse began. Pay attention to the peculiarity of the curse, which you can feel in magic all over the body. This is how spontaneous mutations feel. This is what makes the curse irreversible, and its roots grow from chimerology. We continued to carefully monitor Jugsun's condition with all available charms, whose hair was already beginning to fall off his head and teeth were beginning to fall out of his mouth. Pay attention to the different feeling in magic. It's like numbness of the hand, but at the same time, there is a feeling similar to the tension before the sprint. This is how increased regeneration with elements of transfiguration and its instant cancellation is felt. This is what most of the magical capabilities of the still living body are spent on. As soon as spontaneous mutations lead to the inability of the body to generate magic, this function of the curse will disappear. It is impossible to stop because it is impossible to localize the binding point of the curse to the material carrier. Unfortunately, the affected do not live long. Or fortunately. Suddenly, a piece of greyish flesh with white pus drips slid off Jugsun's arm and fell to the floor with a nasty slap, spreading slightly. That's enough. Hermione didn't have to be asked to stop twice, and the girl quickly, I would even say instantly, was a couple of steps away from the test subject. Delphine pointed her wand at the still-alive Jugsun. Avada Kedavra. A flash of concentrated green light blinded my eyes for a moment, but nothing visually changed. The rotting body sometimes continued to twitch. Evanesco. The corpse was gone, as was everything associated with it. The curse is considered unremovable, Delphine turned to us. But only a few people know it, trying not to apply it. The important thing is that other curses are based on it, related to putrefaction and decay, but much simpler, easier, and I would even say, safer. Caro was throwing decay at me. Only I didn't understand which one. But it was similar. Believe me, smiled Delphine. In England, it's the curse that I, and perhaps a couple of Mungo's healers, know of. It is not local at all, and not even from near abroad. Although, they say that the Dark Lord travelled a lot and could find someone who would show him this curse. After a more thorough cleaning, we left this hidden place. Delphine took us by porte-clés to Hogsmeade. The time was still not very late, and the 3 broomsticks were still working. That's where Lady Greengrass took us. Almost no visitors were left, and Delphine imperceptibly hid us, so no one paid attention to the new visitors. No one except Madame Rosmerta, who immediately hurried over to the table we occupied and clarified the order. Hot chocolate. 3 mugs. And something sweet but light, Delphine answered for us. Hermione was still sitting there pale, but not as pale as when we were studying. Wasn't it too harsh? I asked into thin air. Nothing can shock you, I figured that out a long time ago. But Hermione. Yeah, the girl looked up from her desk. I've noticed more than once that many people who grew up in the ordinary world are under the illusion of security and fairy tale. I suppose it has to do with the fact that society itself creates such an illusion. It's not like that in the magical world. The order was brought to us, and we each took our own mug with a drink. As for sweets, there was a kind of eclairs with a light air cream. Hermione took the mug with both hands, looking thoughtfully at the chocolate, and after a couple of moments, took a few careful sips. Yes, it's not like that, Delphine continued to say no less thoughtfully. Of course, we don't usually have the threat of the Dark Lords hanging over us, and the killer doesn't pop out from around every corner. But as such, there is no security here. Absolutely everyone around you has the opportunity and knowledge to deliver pain, suffering, humiliate with a comic curse, bend you to their will. Of course, there are friends, comrades, and everything else. Therefore, even my teacher of healing magic tried to conduct such a full immersion. Even purebloods like me have been terrified and shocked for a long time. After all, we are all loved and protected by relatives, then a fairly safe school, miracles, and beautiful magic. And then, life, and in it people. And people are the cruelest creatures. After having a snack and finishing the hot chocolate, we started to get ready to go back to the castle. You have homework. I'm counting on your perfect memory, so analyze everything you've memorized, feelings, knowledge, and so on. Relate this to the theory and make notes for each class of curses, giving examples of their effects and treatments. As examples, I would like to see other curses from the same categories as those applied today. For each one, I'd want everything from their manifestations and diagnosis to a detailed treatment plan. There aren't too many Death Eaters to keep coming back to the same practice topic. That was the end of our sit-down, and we left the 3 broomsticks. After putting on a complex of concealing charms, Hermione and I set off at a brisk pace to Hogwarts. We walked in silence. At the very portrait of the fat lady, Hermione took my hand, dispelling the charms. I want to become a healer. A scientist healer. I don't know if there is such a field, but I don't want there to be incurable curses. Hugging her, stroked her unruly hair, wanting to calm her down, and received a hug in return. Can't change it, yes. As long as there are people in the world, Rowena added in Palpatine's voice, which gave me a hard time holding back an inappropriate chuckle. Chapter 395. Once again, the study rushed with unprecedented speed. In early December, the first snow fell, covering everything with a thick white blanket. At the same time, a period of rehabilitation after potions to improve brain and physical activity passed, and Hermione and I leaned on them again, immersing ourselves in training both in magic and physical. Classes with Lady Greengrass got a new schedule, practice alternated with theory. The second practice session, in which Rolly became the guinea pig, took place just at the beginning of December, and the topic of study was curses on the mind and damage to the brain and nervous system. There were many such curses, from the banal confusion of the mind like confundus to cruciatus. Like last time, we did the diagnostics, and Delphine applied the curses to the target. Like last time, the subject passed away, having experienced the full range of mental anguish and other joys of magical life, and like last time, he died before the curse ended. The time for midterm examinations came quite imperceptibly, and the exams themselves were passed as an ordinary test. It would seem what's wrong, well, all wrong. There was not much movement from Umbridge. The only thing she was trying to do was put things in order. Not some ephemeral one, but a real one. No witchcraft in the corridors. It used to be like that, too, but now it was also backed up by ministerial law and put on her personnel file. There is no debauchery in the corridors, and not only, a week of just warnings, after which everyone should get used to the rule, otherwise punishment with entry into a personal file. No disorder and untidiness, forced cleaning of uniforms by means of magic is in force, and nobody cares if a suddenly tightened tie on the uniform shocks a slob. Who suffers the most from this Gryffindor? Why, for most Gryffindors, certain hyperactivity and short temper are the norms. It's reflected in the manner of living in general. Simply put, a whole heap of disciplinary bumps is raining down on us, and Ron and Harry are having the worst of it. The other thing that caused even more worry was the Slytherins, who had fallen silent. And they became quiet globally, along with the Dark Lord and the Death Eaters. There was no movement at all. Calm. And a lull, as you know, happens before a storm. On the first day of vacation, during which almost no one went anywhere this year, and many students stayed to celebrate Christmas here, probably looking for an excuse to annoy Umbridge, I went to London. Why, well, I decided to break the well-established tradition of no presents a little bit and to get something for Hermione completely out of the blue. The problem is, gifts are my weak point. I'm not good at picking them out at all, trying to get something practical, necessary. Anyway, I spent the rest of the evening wandering around London and the magical streets, looking for something that would catch my eye. The sudden realization that Hermione was sounding the alarm came from the ring, and I didn't hesitate to apparate to Hogwarts. It was the moment Tonks had chosen to activate the mirror we occasionally use to communicate, sharing information or opinions about this or that life situation. Speeding through the snow, I pulled out the mirror on the run, and seeing Nymphadора's worried face there, I spoke. I'm kind of busy. Did something happen? As happened, shouted Tonks, and in the background, the Reducto whistled familiarly, followed by, judging by all the same sounds, a collapse of something massive and stony. Sirius is gone, the Order and the Aurors are repulsing some mossy little town. Bombarda Maxima. Stop talking, came Moody's voice. Change in 30. 1 second. Max. From the liaison at the Ministry, they say there's some shit going on. McGonagall is fighting with Umbridge, but she said Potter and a group of students snuck out of the castle, and she didn't have time to stop him. He kept yelling that Sirius was in danger. The puzzle began to form in my head, and I stopped, listening to the ring. The alarm was not from Hogwarts. Don't leave the castle. It's unknown. In 5. Tonks turned off the mirror. Where the hell did you go? I shouted into nowhere, returning by short apparition beyond the edge of the anti-apparition charms. It looks like it started, the signal is weak, and its essence is precisely in the request, not in danger, but it's worth hurrying. Save everyone first, and then it could be very bad because the headmaster has one foot in the grave. Chapter 396. The white blanket of snow, even in the night, flickered quickly beneath me as I moved to the edge of the Hogwarts anti-apparition charms. As soon as I reached them, I immediately landed en route to London on Whitehall Street. Appearing across the street from one of the entrances to the Ministry of Magic, I accidentally pushed a person with my shoulder and immediately checked for the presence of concealment charms on myself. Muggle-repelling charms worked. Ignoring the bewildered man, I headed in the direction of the sensations from Hermione's ring. Not the Ministry, but close by. Just in case, pulling out my wand and checking, as far as possible, the space around with the help of the architect's abilities. I got to the alley between the buildings that stood across the street from the Ministry. It was here that I felt Hermione. Actually, here, out of the reach of street lighting, she was standing, holding her wand at the ready. Miona, I called out to the girl, stepping closer. Is everything okay? I'm fine, she sounded like she was looking for someone on the other side. There's another problem. Tell me. I've been sitting in the common room, like I planned, doing various calculations on the magic storage. By the way, It turns out quite interesting there. But that's not the point. The excited and worried guys from the army came over and asked if I could make a portrait to the ministry. It wasn't hard for me, so I did it. While I was doing it, I could hear that they wanted to break into the Department of Mysteries. It's a terrible crime, but I've been thinking for a long time where to get a time turner to study. Hermione told quickly, and there was excitement on her face, despite the occlumency. Figured I could secretly follow them and, under the guise of their con, get the time turner, and maybe something else unique. Following the guys in stealth, I operat after activating their portal. However, while they were getting ready to enter, I heard a few important things. Max. According to Potter, the Dark Lord has kidnapped Sirius Black and is torturing him in the Department of Mysteries. Harry claims to have seen it in person. Let's say, I looked at the girl, simultaneously feeling the space with the help of the architect. Max, it's an obvious trap. Quietly exclaimed Hermione. There's no way I'd believe a wizard that powerful would allow himself to be peeped on. I mean, he might be crazy, deranged, inconsiderate, or whatever, but as a wizard, he's definitely skilled, strong, and experienced. Potter is being deliberately taken to the Department of Mysteries for some reason, and I can guess why. Prophecy, I don't see any other reason. You could just lure them to any other place. But, then why doesn't he come for it himself? Hermione thought for a moment, but after a couple of seconds, she brushed the thought aside. Perhaps she wrote off such behavior by the Dark Lord as some kind of whim, a fad, or his insanity. Okay. Things happen. A trap, I nodded. And then what? And then, the most interesting. I decided it was too dangerous to go with them. When their group infiltrated the ministry. Hermione shook her head, smiling sadly. Through the elevator in the booth. In general, as soon as they got inside, access to the ministry was closed. What do you mean? There. I've already listened to a few wizards trying to get in. The fireplaces are blocked. The elevators are not responding. The guest passageways and the ones for staff don't work. Above the ministry's dungeon itself is the dome of the prohibition of apparition and short apparition. You can't get there by conventional methods. No one has entered the ministry in the last 20 minutes. They just went out, but there was no way back. Look over there. Hermione nodded behind me. When I turned around, I saw 4 people in slightly strange casual clothes swarming around the grey wall of a large administration building. They pretended to just stand and talk to each other, but now and then, I could see the movements of the wands in their hands and the bewilderment on the faces of the wizards. They've been trying for the last 15 minutes, it seems, to crack the defenses, and there, in the wall, is one of the entrances. I saw wizards walking through it. Okay. I got you. Adventures, intrigues, investigations. Why am I here? Something has to be done. Someone has to be informed. I'm sure that the fact that the ministry building is isolated for at least another hour will be considered a simple technical malfunction. The working day is over, and there are only the occasional duty officers inside, and the same duty aurors, and the DMLE. There's only hope for them if the Dark Lord himself has really set a trap there. They're not there. I shook my head, arousing Hermione's surprise. But they're supposed to. All the squads on duty are called in for defense, or assault. I still don't get it. Anyway, everyone's busy. Chapter 397. Hermione thought again for a moment, then tapped her fist against her palm in surprise. Perfect. What? Everything. Perfect timing for any decisive action on the part of the Dark Lord. Few wizards in the ministry. With agents in place, not a problem. Everyone is just leaving it. The Auror space and the Academy are elsewhere, and here are only the duty officers and those present on business in the DMLE. In the DMLE itself, only those on duty remain, investigators, supervisors, and others go home. Provoke all the security forces to leave the ministry, wait for the victim to come, and that's it, the trap closes. So it's Harry Potter he's after. That's understandable, I nodded. If he didn't need Potter, then such an action could take place any other day. We need to help them. Really, I smirked. Are you sure you want to go there to meet grown-up and experienced wizards, maybe fight them to the death? Do you really have to do that? I don't know what I should do, Max, Hermione shook her head. But I know what I can do. I don't need the Dark Lord at the helm. I don't need his successes. Neither do you. If the Dark Lord wants something, it's worth trying to keep it from him. We don't have to fight him. A couple of surprise strikes, cover the boys, dig in, get on the defensive and wait for backup. You've made up your mind, haven't you? But how do we get in? Hermione smiled. I've already thought of everything. Modern fields of transfiguration prohibition are based not on the prohibition of transfiguration itself but on the impossibility of passing through them the contours of spells for it. The same applies to the prohibition of spatial transfiguration, as well as short apparition. Most likely, those inside will not want to deprive themselves of the advantage of short apparition. The prohibition field spends more magic than a dome or a sphere, which means there's a sphere. And if it is a sphere, then it is worth applying phasing magic. But I haven't started calculating these moments yet. I'm still having fun with lasers. No problem. Look, Hermione reached into the bag behind her shoulder, and after rummaging through it for a few seconds, pulled out a notebook, quickly flipping through it to the right place. Here. Taking the notebook, I immersed myself in reading the notes in the girl's neat handwriting. I know what you're going to ask, so I'm already processing. Rowena's voice echoed in my head, and I literally physically felt a sudden heaviness in my head. Rowena didn't seem to be sparing my body's resources. As I was reading, I began to use magic to add or correct the arithmetic nuances and rune combinations that seemed to be forming themselves in my head. I was very good at refining Hermione's unfinished, incomplete, but structured notes. Not a minute later, I gave the notes back to her, and now she was looking through them quickly, memorizing them, and the wand in her hand seemed to be reflexively and unconsciously twitching. Cool, the girl smiled. I don't understand why you haven't finished your laser project yet. I mean, you calculate everything so quickly. I'm doing a full adaptation of the physical model to minimize the magical costs. If you don't mind the effort spent, then a couple of samples are ready right now. I see. Let's go quickly. Only on one condition. I stopped the girl who was heading out of our dark corner and already wanted to put a concealing charm on herself. You don't go into battle. Def defense. And when we find the guys, you help them in defense, do treatment and other support. I'm too worried about you. So am I for you, Hermione nodded gravely. But it's not like I'm trying to keep you from all your questionable and extremely dangerous adventures. Have a little more faith and trust, Max. Under a complex of concealing charms, we ran across the road, providently skipping a couple of cars, and approached three wizards who pretended to be ordinary citizens talking about their business. It wasn't clear why they were doing it, though, being under Muggle-repelling charm, but what if that was the protocol? Without hesitation, I created a contour for Somnus on the tip of the wand, putting the wizards to sleep, and holding Hermione's hand so as not to lose each other due to our invisibility, I pointed the wand at the area of the wall, which is particularly well felt in magic. To begin with, I tried to penetrate beyond this area with the help of the architect's shadow, but, as I thought, nothing came of it. Spatial transfiguration seemed to run into a wall, beyond which it was simply impossible to penetrate. I modeled the construct. Launch it. Listening to Rowena, I launched the construct. It was as if a translucent light wave spread out from the center of my chest, stopping within 2 meters of Hermione and me. An extremely strange sensation pierced through my body. Unusual, painfully unusual, and in addition to this, there was a feeling as if I had suddenly fallen off a cliff. Goosebumps seemed to run through my insides. But what was much more interesting was that inside this hemisphere, air and light acquired a greenish glow, and at the very edge, in the area of transition from the sphere to ordinary space, a funny visual effect of the aurora appeared. Now, in theory, all magic and spells emanating from this area have a reverse phase. If you can call it that at all. Wasting no time in dialogue with my schizophrenia, I launched the shadow, which turned out to be not the usual black but a rotten green. It passed easily through the barrier that had stopped it moments before. Yanking Hermione's arm, all I got was the sound of gagging and, from the looks of it, the sound masking charms turned off. Disgusting feelings. Hermione whispered softly, and I agreed with her. I could hardly contain myself. Now I'll get us there, then we'll use short apparition if the space is free. Got it. Concentrating as much as possible, I sent the shadow of the architect further along the magically closed area from ordinary people. A mixture of shadow and transfiguration of space, and even mostly under the control of Rowena, easily passed along a kind of thread of charms that connected this wall and the hall deep underground and other games with space, hiding areas, and other nonsense. However, it was enough for the architect's abilities to play the role of a trolley on these magical rails, transferring Hermione and me from point A to point B. Chapter 398. Literally falling out of the wall in a low round hall with many elevators, we came out of the short apparition, and I turned off the magic inverter. Nonsense, Hermione shook her head. I thought it wasn't like that. Yet. I was also expecting not fields in any way, but an outgoing flow of magic. It will need to be redesigned for a different form. But did you notice the smoke of the short apparition was green, like Avada? And this leads to interesting thoughts, won't Protego, based on phase-inverted magic, stop Avada? We looked at each other stupidly for a couple of seconds, after which Hermione shook her head and with it a lush ponytail of hair as if driving away stupid thoughts. Waving her wand in the direction of one of the elevators, Hermione, judging by the devastating explosive effect that occurred, launched Bombarda Maxima into the elevator, tearing the doors and the cabin to shreds. The meaning is clear: it is extremely difficult and incredibly costly to apparate through matter with a rigid crystal lattice. Even for water, there is its own special, somewhat more costly modification. Without wasting any more time talking, we went into short apparition, descending down the elevator shaft in black clouds of smoke. The absolute darkness did not prevent us from moving. All the first elevators lead to the atrium, Hermione's distorted voice came to me, laced with metallic notes. The various pamphlets did not gather dust in bookstores for nothing, and the information in them could come in handy at the most unexpected moment. Very soon, a bright spot appeared at the end of the shaft. I flew out into the atrium of the ministry and quickly looked around. Even with the overview vision in short apparition, it is impossible to pay attention to the entire field of vision at the same time. Consciousness is not immediately ready to rebuild and process a completely different amount of data. The light in the atrium was much dimmer than at normal times, and the hall was in semi-darkness. There was no fire burning in the fireplaces, but the golden symbols on the ceiling continued their unknown dance, filling the space with very weak light. We flew under the atrium ceiling towards the fountain and then to the hall with elevators. There was no one where the wizard on duty was supposed to be sitting at the inspection point, and this is a 24-hour post. Another bombarda, performed by Hermione, blew the hell out of one of the elevator booths, scattering large shards of stone, iron, and other material aside, along with a dense cloud of dust. We flew down the elevator shaft again, and I asked Rowena to participate as fully as possible in the whole thing. No time to test my own abilities. If I were alone I would try out my skills without her help, but right now, I'm too worried about Hermione, even though I'm suppressing this feeling. Ideally, I'm worried about the others, even though I don't know who went with Potter. It's funny how long coexistence in childhood affects this. I probably wouldn't even be able to kill the jerk and scoundrel Malfoy in cold blood. But Selwyn, whom I saw only occasionally, I could easily. How cunning the founders were. I'm willing to bet that it wasn't just for the sake of unified and versatile basic education that they built Hogwarts. You live like that and see someone almost every day for 7 years, and then it's hard to kill them. Intrigue, plotting, you're welcome. But to kill? Of course, that doesn't stop some people or even vice versa, but still. The elevator shaft didn't want to end. Miona, wait, I shouted into space, stopping. Yes, came Hermione's voice nearby. We were hovering in this completely black space. Only through sensitivity to magic did we retain the ability to sense each other. I need to answer. It didn't take me long to realize that the slight discomfort of being in short apparition was caused by the communication mirror. As I pulled it out and brought my hand with it out of the apparition, I saw Tonks' face in the reflection, with the bustling members of the Order of the Phoenix in the background, but far from in its entirety. Tonks was about to say something, but all she saw was darkness, of that I was sure. Max. I'm in the dark and in short apparition, my voice was distorted but recognizable. Where are you? It doesn't matter, though, Nymphadора's face read slight tiredness and relief. At the ministry. In the ministry. Moody flashed in the background. He immediately turned in our direction, walked briskly to Tonks, and snatched the mirror from her hands. "Listen carefully, rookie." Moody was now looking at me with his new prosthetic, and his voice was quiet and judicious. "The Ministry is surrounded by a bunch of blocking barriers, and we, like other wizards, have an extreme need to get there. We need to find whoever's putting up those barriers, which is definitely human, and he must be as garlanded with artifacts as a Christmas tree." "What are you even doing there?" "Here Potter went with the company to rescue Sirius. Apparently, I will have to save him." "Ugh!" spat Moody angrily. "Dragon shit. So that's it." Moody allocated a couple of seconds of his life to tricky swearing, after which he looked in the mirror again. "Look for this wizard, rookie. Every second counts. It's only a matter of time before we break down the barriers here. But we may not have it. Most likely, there are several Death Eaters, and most likely, the barrier holder is among them. And if I were the leader of the group, I wouldn't entrust this matter to anyone." "Yes. Exactly. Look for that idiot Potter. If you find him you'll find the others." Without saying goodbye, Moody gave the mirror to Nymphadora. "Hang in there." Tonks smiled not very confidently and ended the communication session. Chapter 399. "Did you hear them?" I asked Hermione, putting the mirror away. "Yes. But we're stuck here. It looks like the interior of the Ministry is connected by elevators like through space distortion. We're not going to get there that easily." And it seemed like an easy option. Having launched the architect's abilities to the full, Rowena and I tried to walk along these spatial anomalies, and it helped a semblance of tree roots formed in my head, which are an interpreted map. As I understood, without having a clear reference point, we were just wandering in this spatial anomaly linking the levels of the Ministry together. What will they think of inventing next? I know where to go. "Give me your hand, I'll get through." Hermione materialized her hand, though I had to find it almost by touch. As soon as I took her by the hand, I immediately pulled her into my apparition, which was somewhat more difficult, but here Hermione helped to maintain this transfiguration of space without causing really great difficulties in its paired performance. Trusting the architect's abilities, I set off in the seemingly right direction, and after a couple of moments, we were thrown into a small dark hall with smooth black tiles on the walls. Several passageways were leading out of the hall, but only one led to the noise of spells and some kind of commotion. "Remember my condition?" "Of course." I pushed absolutely all my abilities to the max. At the same time, connecting Rowena's computing power to the full, not forgetting to use her in controlling both magic and the body if necessary, I rushed into the paired apparition into the passage from where the noise was heard. And I will also try to implement at least a little magical effect, similar to the Delphine ritual. Effectiveness less than 10%. Without potions, even an exact reproduction of the influence won't bring a really meaningful result. But even a couple of percent is already good. How do we proceed? You already know. We rush in, assess the situation, attack as quickly and harshly as possible, simultaneously saving someone if necessary, and then try not to die. That's a great plan. After all, it looks like the hat is never wrong. In a huge round hall with infinitely high dark vaulted ceilings, on the central platform, on a pedestal, stood a high ancient stone arch. It seemed as if the arch was covered with some kind of torn transparent fabric, or smoke, or maybe some kind of flowing water. Rows of benches rose from the platform in a circle like an amphitheater, and several passages led to the hall itself, where the benches ended. But that was not what the hall was notable for at the moment. On the central platform, at the very pedestal with an arch, 8 teenagers were grouped. They looked terrible, multiple scorch marks on clothing, traces of blood, bruises, and abrasions. Ginny Weasley, a red-haired girl, was sitting on the floor, leaning her back against the pedestal, occasionally helping her comrades put up a translucent grey dome of Protego Totalis. She could not stand, her legs were broken in several places and unnaturally twisted. Shoulder to shoulder with the girl sat a chubby boy of medium height, clutching a recently received wound with his hand, but no one had time to help, and he could not because he was unable to pronounce a single intelligible spell. The red-haired twins looked a little better, quite deftly holding and updating the protection or sometimes transfiguring various objects that protected against spells, sometimes breaking through the protection. Another red-haired guy, tall and ungainly, was lying unconscious next to them, and his friend, Harry Potter, was helping the twins as much as he could. The pale blonde in a strange combination of clothes of different colors looked the best in this company. By some miracle, she managed to dodge the spells of the Death Eaters, who were now throwing spells at the teenagers' defenses. Harry Potter has never felt more helpless in his life than at the moment. Any decision will be wrong. A dozen and a half Death Eaters in black clothes and robes drove them like kittens. Playfully. While the guys who followed Harry to save his godfather could barely defend themselves from the Hall of Prophecies itself, not even finding time to negotiate, the Death Eaters easily threw spells even during their ridicule and mockery. No other than by a miracle, all the guys are alive. For now. It wasn't until the moment they were here and took up defensive positions at the pedestal with the arch that Harry realized the full meaning of Knight's taunts about how you want to go out against an adult wizard. After all, Harry thought training made sense. After all, he learned an incredible amount of spells last year. After all, he and the guys trained so much. And now Harry realized the gulf of difference between a student, an ordinary wizard, a layman, or an employee of the Ministry's Peace Department. Now, when none other than Barty Crouch Jr., standing 10 meters away from the protection of the guys, held a wand at the Temple of Sirius, who was kneeling, tortured and broken, demanding a ball of prophecy that Harry held in his hands, and his friends and comrades, like Sirius himself, shout, "Don't you dare! I'm sick of it!" Crouch shouted, smiling furiously, licking his lips. "Stop playing with them! They've arranged Mordred knows what here. Oh, our little Barty is upset." A tall, statuesque witch with a crown of unruly black hair and a crazy smile in all 32 perfect white teeth spoke as if talking to a small child. Bellatrix Lestrange, and it was she, lazily pointed her wand at the Protogo Dome, under which the teenagers were hiding. A spell or two came at the dome every second, either spreading out or breaking it cleanly, and Harry clearly understood that if the Death Eaters wanted to, they would have smeared them with a thin layer on the walls of the Ministry long ago. Avada Kedavra, Bellatrix lazily uttered the words of the unforgivable curse, and the bright green ray passed through the protection unhindered. Chapter 400. George reacted in time and placed a transfigured steel tray under the beam, which collapsed, but also stopped the spell. "Look, Barty," Bellatrix danced joyfully around her comrade, causing Harry a painfully persistent déjà vu. "They're still holding on. It's great, isn't it?" Another spell from one of the Death Eaters flew into the defense again, smashing and collapsing the dome as if it were made of glass. "Protogo totalis," Ginny restored it immediately, still leaning her back against the pedestal. "Fiantu Duri," Luna Lovegood strengthened the defense but suddenly looked up somewhere. "Darkness is coming. How much worse can it get?" thought Harry. If it hadn't been for Max's advice, they might have been killed even sooner. Crouch Jr. was acting too tough. Suddenly one of the doors to the hall swung open. Another black smoke flew through the opening at an incredible speed, in which the Death Eaters fly. It was flying so fast that Harry couldn't follow it with his eyes. Suddenly, this smoke erupted into a whole fan of incredibly fast blue spell arrows rushing towards the Death Eaters, and behind Crouch, the floor rippled and exploded, scattering the stones. A split second, and the black smoke flew up to Crouch and Sirius, again bursting into a heap of multicolored spells and splitting into two. One grabbed Sirius and rushed to the protection of the guys, smashed it casually, immediately turning into Hermione. She threw Sirius on the floor and, spinning on the spot, put a triple Protogo totalis, adding some more spells that Harry didn't know. The Death Eaters didn't stand still either and began to spread out, flying up and sideways in the same black smoke, spewing out dozens of beams of spells. For a couple of moments, Harry could see Max, but he was moving jerkily and so fast that he disappeared from sight. Sometimes he turned into black smoke, and the speed with which he moved his wand arm, now blocking and now reflecting back beams and clots of spells, alternating between the familiar Protogo and unknown reddish shield films, was astounding. The world around them was mired in an endless and uninterrupted series of pops, explosions, flashes. Every now and then, benches and floor exploded, scattering fragments around. Jets of flame from the Death Eaters' spells blazed, melting the stones and stairs of the hall into red lava, and the pile of multicolored arrows had no end at all. Hermione leaned over Sirius without further ado, starting to conjure something, instantly straightening broken bones, applying splints, and so on. And Harry, like the rest of the guys, were in silent surprise. not forgetting to strengthen the defense, against which the fragments from the explosions knocked with an endless fraction. One of the Death Eaters tried to directly break through to the defense. Harry managed to see him and began to raise his wand. However, he did not know how to knock the wizard out of this black smoke when suddenly Max, not even really paying attention to it, just waved his wand. A damn fast translucent clot turned the black smoke of the Death Eater into a bloody fountain, instantly splattering the dome of protection. There was a sound of vomiting from the side. Several powerful spells hit the floor under Max, exploding in a column of flame and leaving craters. Still, Max dodged, covering himself with protection, and again responded with a translucent clot, but missed, and the clot literally dug a spiral-shaped crater 3 meters in diameter and at least a meter deep in the wall. At least a dozen clots of rotting colors, ranging from green to purple, rushed toward Max suddenly. Small black flat discs appeared all over the hall. Rotten-colored clumps of spells fell into them, disappearing but appearing from completely different ones, and some even managed to return to the sender's 2 Death Eaters, not expecting this, accidentally fell under them, disintegrating into bleeding pieces of bodies. The cries, shouts, and commands of the Death Eaters were drowned in an endless stream of spells. Max suddenly disappeared, appearing in the air between 2 clouds of smoke, and it seemed as if he himself exploded into impenetrable darkness, which immediately spat out the bloody bodies of 2 Death Eaters. Several particularly powerful beams hit Max from above and exploded in a bright flash, sending the guy with the speed of a projectile fired from a cannon to the platform's edge with a pedestal. Stone chips and dust flew up from the fall, and a couple of benches scattered into splinters. Everything froze, and the remaining Death Eaters took their form again, landing and holding the place of Max's fall at gunpoint. Harry, to his surprise, realized that no more than 10 seconds had passed since the start of the fight. "This is the end," Potter whispered quietly, noticing to himself that Hermione, even though she was already conjuring over Ginny, had seen the entire battle, as well as all the bloody pieces flying here and there across the hall. No one said anything, and even Bellatrix, who was always laughing mockingly, was looking extremely serious at the spot where night had fallen. "We've caught you at last. You piece of shit." Barty Crouch spat blood, adjusting the sleeves of his black draped jacket. Chapter 401. There was almost nothing intact in the hall. The Death Eaters had done most of the damage, and if Harry had recently realized that there was a huge skill gap between him and those wizards, he was now beginning to roughly grasp its size. They didn't just play with him and his squad, they didn't even raise a wand against them, you might say. Suddenly the stones, large and small, that had fallen from above onto Night's Fall, moved, and in a moment, as if they were made of foam, moved aside, showing everyone unharmed, but in a slightly torn coat, a living Max. "I'd forgotten I'd be tougher under the strengthening," he said quietly, shaking the dust off his coat. None of the Death Eaters were taking any action, but Harry noticed a shadow creeping swiftly up from behind Max. Could it be one of them? Harry saw that Max noticed it, too, but he only smiled. "How about a magic trick?" No one answered him, waiting. Only the rustle and creak of stone chips under his feet sounded in the hall. "I'm gonna make," Max pulled a second wand from his pocket, "this wand disappear." This movement of his provoked a shadow that had crept up almost close to him to attack sharply, rushing at Max clearly faster than a human could do. It was the Death Eater, holding a long knife. With an incredibly quick movement, Max managed to parry the lunge from his back, and with lightning speed, he plunged a second wand into his enemy's eye. Ta-dam! The Death Eater fell backwards to the floor, frozen with no sign of life, and the tip of the wand's hilt sticking out of his eye, at an angle, as if going into his neck. It didn't evaporate. Whoops! These words served as a trigger, and fast and powerful dark beams of spells flew toward Max, without further ado, but Max literally scattered in darkness, immediately settling to the floor. The spell beams exploded, burned, and reduced to ashes several cubic meters of stone where the blond man had just been. In the next second, a black silhouette rose from the floor behind Crouch Jr. It swung an equally black sword upward from below, cutting the wizard apart, disappearing again, but growing under the guy's dome of protection. "And now into a defensive position," said the black silhouette in Max's voice, immediately turning into the guy himself, who began to apply more and more protective charms with incredible speed, strengthening the dome of the Protego to absurd indicators. It was no longer just a grey translucent film interspersed with Hermione's charms. It was already a nearly opaque, luminous shield, and the multiple beams of spells began to beat helplessly against it. Wasting no time, Max began to examine the injured guys, waving a wand over them. No one dared to say anything, focusing on defense and preparing to restore something at any moment. As a result, the guys did not notice how white clumps of smoke burst into the hall, engaging in a fierce battle with the remnants of the Death Eaters. However, after a few seconds, the Death Eaters began to retreat. "Where's Potter?" Max asked the guys, and suddenly everyone looked at each other. Where did that? That bastard!" Max quickly stepped out of the field of protection, removing it, and the guys, still in a state of shock, bristled at Moody and Tonks with their wands. "Calm down, folks," Moody grinned. "Where's Potter?" "He was here a moment ago," Hermione said, looking strangely in the direction Max was supposed to run off to. "Where are the Death Eaters?" Retreating, Tonks hurried over to the students, who suddenly began to settle to the floor, hiding their eyes exhaustedly. "You all need to go to the hospital right away." Moody took something out of his pocket and began to say quickly but quietly that Potter had disappeared again. Chapter 402. I ran as fast as I could down the corridors and stairs of the ministry in near total darkness. My gut was telling me where Potter had gone, but much better than intuition, I could tell by the sheer volume of magic that literally exploded nearby. The saddest thing was that the forced load almost drank me to the bottom. Tough creatures, those Death Eaters. "It's very good that I killed Dolohov first." He managed to give out more than a third of the total destruction and spells from the Death Eaters for the whole fight in a few seconds. An expert in his field. Bella also turned out to be good, though her attacks are very spot on, and a couple of times, she almost killed me. And now I'm dragging my feet, being not very sure of my sanity, hurrying after Potter. There's the atrium and disappointment. I wanted to see it. I really wanted to. In the middle of a dilapidated long hall, in which about half of the entire floor and walls covering remained, where the statues that stood on the fountain lie broken and fused in a completely different place, Potter was kneeling, banging his forehead on the floor and pounding it with his fists. Dumbledore was sitting on the floor with his back against the partition between the two fireplaces, bleeding and breathing heavily. A bald Voldemort in a black Jedi costume and a black cloak walked back and forth around this whole composition. As soon as I appeared in the hall, he immediately noticed me. "Ah, Mr. Knight." He smiled broadly, and I tried to get away with shadows. As soon as I started forming them, Voldemort simply waved his hand, and I was pushed forward, rolling across the floor almost to Dumbledore's body, still alive. "You should say goodbye to your beloved headmaster," Voldemort scoffed, pacing back and forth and spreading magic around him in huge volumes. Intentional or not, it didn't matter, but I could sense the meaning of such chimerism, as well as the benefits in terms of power. "I'll even be so gracious that I won't interfere because I have something to discuss with Harry Potter, don't I?" Voldemort abruptly appeared next to Potter. I just now realized how exhausted he really was, but at the same time, he didn't forget to keep us all in sight, bending over Potter and whispering something to him quietly. "You will laugh, Mr. Knight," Dumbledore muttered, smiling sadly. His half-glasses were no longer on. But I slipped on my own robe at a crucial moment. I clearly felt in magic that the headmaster was no longer a fighter, but he had enough strength to try to get up, and I helped him in that endeavor. Voldemort was wary, but not much. He also seemed to understand the deplorable situation of Dumbledore, and he did not perceive me at all as an opponent. "And you're not his opponent right now. You've put in a lot of powers. Voldemort is also not in the best condition right now, and you could compete with him, but it's unlikely that you will be able to overcome him, and you won't be able to use a sword in close combat. He just won't let you near him with the volume of magic." Chimera. Suddenly, the fireplaces began to blaze with green fire, and Voldemort erected a pillar of some kind of ash shield around himself and Potter. Wizards in a variety of clothes from civilians to aurors, poured out of fireplaces, and Fudge was at the head of this procession. When they saw the Dark Lord, everyone froze. "I hate prophecies," I muttered, supporting the headmaster and apparently preventing him from falling. "I understand you so well," he nodded. Voldemort circled around Potter for a few more seconds, saying something inaudible to us, and then he looked at the headmaster and me. "You know what, old man," grinned Voldemort. "I won't kill you now. I see that you've managed to pick up a deadly, unremovable curse somewhere. I can feel death slowly coursing through your veins. And I will leave you to die from it so that you can feel the full depth of your powerlessness against me, Lord Voldemort." Then he disappeared in a black whirlwind, leaving an unhappy and broken Potter. There was silence in the ruined atrium for some time. "He's really back," muttered Fudge. "Voldemort is back." "Amazing foresight," the headmaster smiled sadly. "It's time for us to go to the hospital, it seems to me." Chapter 403. To the hospital wing of Hogwarts, the headmaster, the shocked Potter, and I left by the fireplace from the ministry atrium. Strangely enough, Madame Pomfrey, who immediately came out to us, found only severe exhaustion in everyone, plus a minimal amount of various minor injuries. I was hurt, too, and mostly not from spells, but from becoming a projectile that ploughed the stone floor and the benches in the hall with the archway. Dumbledore easily managed to convince Madame Pomfrey that we didn't need any special treatment and that we needed to talk in his office urgently. Reluctantly, Madame Pomfrey let us go, reproaching us for our irresponsible attitude toward our health. "What about the others?" As if waking up for a moment from his depressed and broken state, Potter spoke. "They will be brought by people from the Order," the headmaster replied soothingly as we walked through the corridors of the castle. "And Sirius? What about Sirius? He's not allowed into Hogwarts. Sirius has someone to take care of him at headquarters as well." "But..." Potter wanted to be indignant but was immediately interrupted by just one serious look from the headmaster. If Sirius hadn't left headquarters and tried to constantly violate security regulations, nothing would have happened. "Wouldn't it, Mr. Potter?" He had nothing to answer, and we got to the headmaster's office in silence. The darkness of night had no power over the office, lit by the fire in the fireplace and the bright glare of the open cabinet with the pensieve. Dumbledore reached the chair behind his desk and sat down, letting the emotion of physical relief show on his face for a second. But he didn't let himself relax for long, gesturing for us to sit in the chairs opposite and leaning on his left arm. Potter looked tired and exhausted, and the abrasions and various external injuries gave him the appearance of some ragamuffin from the street. "You took the prophecy, didn't you, Mr. Potter?" the headmaster asked, looking at the guy. Harry glanced at me briefly but decided that since the headmaster was asking about it in my presence, then it was okay. "Yes, headmaster." When we ended up in the Hall of Prophecy, I noticed it almost immediately. Among many others. "Yes, headmaster." As soon as I picked it up, the Death Eaters appeared immediately, dragging Sirius behind them. Barty Crouch, Jr., was clearly leading them. They demanded the prophecy in exchange for Sirius and his life. "Why, headmaster, couldn't they have taken it themselves?" "You see, Mr. Potter," the headmaster tried to sit up more comfortably but only achieved a slight pain, judging from his face. "The prophecy records are arranged in such a way that only the one about whom the prophecy is about can take them, so, what happened to the prophecy?" "Voldemort took it." Harry clenched his fists. I can't figure out how I ended up there myself." "You, Mr. Potter," Dumbledore managed, even in such a gloomy and not the most illuminated atmosphere, to flash the half-moon spectacles that he put on who knows when. "You fell outright in the middle of our fight in the apparition funnel." "Wait, what?" I couldn't contain my surprise. "Isn't the entire ministry protected from apparition?" "Absolutely, Mr. Knight," Dumbledore nodded. "But I think I know the reason for this." "May I ask?" "Perhaps, but first, I would like to ask Mr. Potter what forced him to apparate, and when did he acquire such curious skills?" Harry didn't hesitate, no. He just stared at the headmaster's desk, trying to formulate his thoughts. "The guys and I have been practicing different spells." At that moment, the flames in the fireplace lit up green, and the headmaster and I pulled out our wands almost simultaneously but made no other movements. Moody came out of the flames, tapping his staff on the floor and cheerfully moving towards the vacant chair next to us. "Mordred knows what!" he exclaimed, limping. As soon as Alastor sat down heavily in a chair, straightening his prosthetic leg, he immediately reached into his bosom, taking out a flask from there. The smell of alcohol immediately spread through the office. After taking a couple of sips and wiping his mouth with his sleeve, the old Auror looked at us. "What are you staring at? We didn't catch anyone. Those bastards worked the getaway like never before." I wouldn't be surprised if Crouch was developing the operation. May the devils roast him in hell for eternity. Are you a believer? Asked Potter immediately. No, Harry, Alastor shook his head. But I fucking love the idea of such an afterlife for these creatures. Alastor, the headmaster looked reproachfully at Moody, but the latter only brushed him off. You were breaking the defenses, weren't you? Yeah, we were breaking while you and that rascal Fletcher, who is only good to get somewhere, were unraveling the blocking of fireplaces. We were just about past the defenses. Moody took another sip of his swill, putting the flask back, when the defenses suddenly collapsed. Well, we had one last push left. That's when it came down on our own ministerial defense. Just as I thought, the headmaster nodded. That's what broke the anti-apparition barrier. Then why didn't everyone apparate from there, and there, too? I couldn't understand the situation. And why didn't you do it yourself? I thought about it. Indeed, why didn't I apparate? Although now I could accurately recall the changed magic well, my protection did not mean the isolation of those inside. Even I, when I took it off, first began to pass through the shields. I don't know, somehow I got used to the idea that you can't apparate at Hogwarts and the Ministry. It's the same story here, the headmaster nodded. Back to Mr. Potter and his reasons for apparating. We're listening to you. Chapter 404. Potter looked up, looking straight into the headmaster's eyes. I felt like I really needed to be in that place. I saw Voldemort torture members of the Order who came to help. Rookie. Ugh, spat, but only with a sound. Moody didn't even suggest that Voldemort himself put these thoughts into you. I have never been wrong when I saw things through his eyes. Potter clearly wanted to be outraged, but he didn't have the physical and moral strength for this. Neither did he have the strength to fix his cracked round glasses. You think you can't make a mistake? I glared at Potter. But the decisions you make could get you and everyone who follows you killed. Do you understand that? I should have abandoned him. He looked defiantly. You should have notified the competent wizards about what happened. And Sirius is already an adult wizard, and he put you and your friends in danger with his antics. Voldemort has the prophecy. Well, the headmaster smiled reassuringly. Relax. Everything ended well. It depends for whom, Alastor grinned, and in response to the headmaster's questioning look, continued. This rookie caused such a beating in the death chamber. There was no stone left unturned, and there were 7 casualties among the Death Eaters, including Crouch. Dumbledore looked at me reproachfully. Don't make that your face, grinned Moody, turning to the headmaster. As we understand it, Max has managed to get the Death Eaters under their own spells and curses. That's good to hear. The headmaster covered his eyes for a few moments. Mr. Knight, I'd like to thank you for your help. No need to, headmaster, I waved it off. I won't detain anyone anymore. You, Mr. Potter, I will ask you to stay. Alastor took a couple of parchments out of his coat, placed them on the headmaster's desk, and headed for the fireplace. I went to the office's exit and then to the common room of the house. Wandering through the dark corridors of the castle, I was thinking about what to do and how to proceed. It is obvious that Voldemort will regret that he did not kill me on the spot, and after my escapade, he will definitely pay close attention to me, which does not promise anything good. Some vague idea was persistently spinning in my head that it was time to move on to decisive and selfless measures. But how? Yes, and it's worth figuring out exactly what passed to me from Crouch's soul. Although I gave the sword the task of sending to rebirth, the sword still took some crumbs. What kind it is not clear. As with the dragon, I still do not understand what I got from it. As soon as I entered the common room, the eyes of the few students gathered here from the senior courses were directed at me at the same moment. They were clearly curious, but they didn't seem to know the whole story yet, since not a single person involved in the recent mess was here. When I looked around, I didn't notice Hermione. Hermione came by. A couple of students shook their heads negatively. Maybe she decided to stay in the hospital wing after leaving the common room. I went to the hospital wing. Even though it was the middle of the night, not a single teacher came across. In the hospital wing, Madame Pomfrey confirmed that Hermione was here, but already asleep under her potions, and anyway, the night is no time for visits. I left the hospital wing of the castle, and after putting on a variety of charms of concealment, I left Hogwarts altogether, having moved from the border of anti-apparition charms directly to London. The capital could please with an infrequent sight, snow. White and fluffy, right now, large flakes falling from the sky, bringing with them a sense of celebration. This holiday feeling was fueled by the various working establishments, brightly colored storefronts, Christmas decorations on houses, and couples or groups of people of various ages, beaming with good mood, subtly hinted that a little more, a couple of days, and Christmas would come. It even seemed that you were about to hear the traditional chimes of bells on Santa's sleigh. Grinning at such thoughts, I moved along one of the central streets, the snow creaking under my feet. Thoughts about the need for decisive action formed in my head into something more definite, and the longer I walked, the more clear the suicidal plan became, immediately requiring implementation. Oh ho ho, came the familiar bird cry behind me, and out of habit, putting my elbow to the side, I could watch Pirate land on it, as if on a perch. And what have you brought me? I smiled at the perpetually disheveled owl. Oh ho! Nothing. Oh ho ho, the pirate stared at me with one eye, opening it wide and as if in shock. You're not such a simple bird, are you, owl? Oh ho! Okay, I've got a job for you. Dropping my bag from my shoulder, I pulled out the parchment. I wrote a small letter on it with magic without a wand and handed it to the pirate, sending it to its destination. Now I could walk around the city some more. Chapter 405. When I reached Piccadilly on foot, deftly dodging the occasional person walking down the street, I heard the familiar oh ho ho as the pirate sat on a lamppost a couple of meters away from me. As soon as I approached, the owl, in its usual manner, dropped the envelope, which had glided precisely into my hands, and then, with a hoot of a goodbye, flew away. I checked the envelope for surprises while it was still flying, so I opened it without fear, and after reading the text, I immediately apparatted away. The spatial puncture of the apparition led me straight to the site for such movements, and opposite stood Delphine's country house, covered with snow, and the witch herself stood in a tightly wrapped robe on the threshold. Judging by the way the robe bulged a little in different places, it was clear to me that some thick clothes with fur or some other collar were under it. We moved towards each other, and the witch took out a small book from under the robe. I hope, she began instead of greeting, that you won't do anything rash. Purely for study purposes, I smiled, accepting the book and placing it in my bag, immediately throwing it over my shoulder. Thank you. When do you want it back? It's a copy. As the saying goes, burn after reading. Will do, I nodded, smiling again. Thank you. Delphine nodded and escorted me back to the grounds, from where I apparatted straight to Grimmauld Place, into the now familiar dark passage. After checking the surroundings with the architect's abilities and not finding anything suspicious, I quickly got to the 12th house and went inside. Silence. After hanging my coat on a hanger in the hallway, I cleaned myself of snow and dirt with magic, then went to the hall with a portrait of Walburga. A wonderful night for a walk, isn't it? A painted witch greeted me, contrary to expectations, drinking a glass of no less painted wine. You are right, Lady Walburga. However, I have no time to talk, and therefore, please excuse me. Young people, the lady uttered profoundly, taking a sip of wine. Always rushing somewhere, hurrying, chasing one thing, losing another along the way, and not appreciating what you have. That's not we. That's life, I replied, heading for my office. I heard a quiet and not at all aristocratic snort, showing Walburga's attitude to what I said. Creaker, I said quietly, make me a snack. I'm in my office. Even though the house elf didn't show up, I know he heard me, and so I had no doubt that there would be a snack. Entering the office and inhaling the familiar and pleasant air filled with the aroma of expensive wooden furniture and subtle notes of books in the cabinets, I quickly sat down at the armchair, and took out the book I received from Delphine from my bag. I was only interested in one thing in this book: how a Horcrux is created. Although it is worth reading any other black stuff that is in these secrets of the darkest arts. A minute later, various light snacks appeared on the table, but I was already completely absorbed in fast reading and data processing. Nasty book. Perhaps the most disgusting of all I have read in the restricted section and in the Black's library. Lines, diagrams, and descriptions of various magical manipulations calmly fit into the existing knowledge in my head, forming a kind of the whole picture. It was only in the morning that I finished with the book, destroying it with the help of incendio and leaning back in an easy chair, allowing my consciousness to process the information. "Morning tea, dear head," Kriaker called out to me, but I was only glad of such a thing. The old house elf put a tray with a mug of tea, a teapot, and a plate of very sweet cakes on an empty place at the table, just what my brain needed. "Thank you, Kriaker," I nodded, starting on such a breakfast. Old Kriaker is glad to serve the head of the noble and most ancient house of Black faithfully. Sometimes he says such lines, but I think it's useless to do something here, and it's pointless. Chapter 406. After breakfast, I noticed that the horizon was beginning to lighten outside the window, which meant it was time to move on to the second stage of the experiment. I went down to the first floor and headed for the exit. I put on my coat and enchanted myself with the charms of concealment and so on, and apparat, not just anywhere, but to a dead end in the backyard of the leaky cauldron. Why hadn't I thought of that before? The rules of decency are observed because I didn't apparate into the house. The law is observed, and the charms are not disturbed around the Diagon alley. You can't apparate from there and there. Quickly opening the passage, I slipped like an invisible shadow into the still empty alley, the stores and shops of which were still closed, and the rare magic lanterns flooded everything with a dim yellow light. Without wasting any time, I headed to Nocturne Alley. The goal is a few hot spots, the memory of which was preserved by Rowena after my personality disorder. It was in these places that I was looking for someone to experiment on. While walking along the alleys, in which the light of day is a rare guest, I thought about a simple question. Why does there even exist such a place as Nocturne Alley? The answer comes by its self-control. If you pin down all these magical incompetents, homeless people, petty thieves, smugglers, and other rabble, then it will automatically go to the outside world, because since they are here, they do not have the skills to make their own safe corner. They'll scatter everywhere, make a mess, threaten the statute of secrecy with their inability to conceal their magic, and so on. And here, in Nocturne Alley, allowing the rabble to live, the ministry keeps it under control, and petty crime is petty enough not to be of interest. The big players, like Borgen and Burks, probably live on kickbacks. Outspoken criminals are being eradicated. At least during that short time of my acquaintance with Nocturne Alley, the owners of several specifically black businesses changed here, and the businesses themselves didn't live long, once turning into ashes. This is one of those firms, new but still alive, that interests me. After passing a couple of suspicious characters, I got to a basement in a ramshackle old stone building and lurked across the street. I waited till dawn, and it was only at first light that a slightly hunched, a massive wizard came out of the basement. From under the black hood of his cloak, an evil and cold look of a seasoned murderer looked at the world. I saw such. Not a maniac, but a murderer. Without any wands or extra movement, I sent a few paralyzing ones at the wizard. He managed to fight off two of them instantly but missed the third, falling backwards. I added a few more to be sure, then put him to sleep and transfigured his body into a statuette, immediately using telekinesis and putting it in my pocket. Within a few hours, I had a few more test subjects to experiment with, and after some successful target captures, I walked briskly out of Nocturne and then left the Diagon Alley, apparating back to Grimwald. Without explaining anything to anyone, I walked briskly down to the ritual hall with its smooth walls and floor. I sat on the floor there and began to think about the Horcruxes in more detail, using Rowena's resources in the process. It turned out that to create a Horcrux properly, in the understanding of the author of the book, you need three things: a ritual scheme or its equivalent in the form of a spell, a means to shatter the stability of the soul, and an object that will eventually become a Horcrux. The ritual scheme was shown in the book, and its complexity is not too great, something like the soul catcher. It collects and holds either the scattered fragments of the soul or some large part of it. In the case of fragments, the ritual mixes them up thoroughly and then places it in an object, locking it there in a special way. If a piece of the soul is whole, then the mixing stage is omitted. The question is how to damage the soul, not mine. No, I don't need it. Someone else's. A banal way comes to mind: use Crucio to the point of insanity. You think right in the words that sounded in my head from Rowena, you could literally feel the consonant nods. I have been analyzing the methods of influencing the soul for several months, relying on your both magical and ordinary knowledge and theories. And what conclusions have you come to? There is a high probability that the soul has some infinitesimal particle in all understandings, which is a kind of core. This idea is suggested by theories about the structure of matter because ordinary science now and then discovers particles that make up larger ones. It is quite possible that sooner or later, some basic particle will be discovered. But that's not the only thing. The Horcruxes known to us didn't show real independence in actions, didn't evolve, and didn't develop. At least based on the available data. They, like a program, acted and influenced the world around them within the limits of the knowledge and worldview that they received at the time of creation. Interesting. And if to remember the old man's words, when I just appeared before him, saying, "You have not passed purification," it turns out that this very purification before rebirth was supposed to remove everything superfluous from life and send only the very core to be reborn. That's how I see it. It turns out that if the world holds the particles belonging to the soul, the wizard can keep himself from leaving the world if he wants and wishes to live. I think so too. But in order to do that, the soul needs to retain the superfluous because it forms the personality, desires, mind, and so forth. Sounds logical. And so we will test this in the simplest and most effective way possible. Chapter 407. Getting up from the floor and taking the wand in my hand, I directed the energy of hemomancy through it because control would be better through the wand. With a few bloody threads, I carved a not particularly intricate ritual scheme on the floor of the ritual hall, consisting of a couple of circles, triangles, and 36 ancient runes. Throwing the bag off my shoulder, I found an almost worn-out pencil there and put it in place in the diagram where the object should lie for Horcrucification. Horcruxing doesn't matter. Taking the figurine of the first test subject out of my coat pocket, I shamelessly threw it into the center of the ritual scheme, cancelling the transformation in flight, and a wizard in dark rags collapsed on the floor. Asleep. Throwing Silencio, Incarcerus at him and awakening him with Renervate, I began to infuse the scheme of the ritual with magic, not paying attention to the wizard, who silently imitated a caterpillar. When the drawings on the floor acquired a slight bluish glow, signaling the readiness of the scheme to capture the particles of the soul, I materialized the spirit sword, still black, with a greenish tint and a rough handle. The wizard began to depict the caterpillar more productively, and turning over on his stomach, began to crawl away, bending his legs under him. With each step I took, I put a simple task before my sword more and more clearly, split the soul in two. When I got close to the wizard, I swung my sword, and I sliced the wizard in two with a sharp movement. To my slight but quickly passed surprise, the wizard himself remained intact, and the ritual scheme became red, the soul was caught, and the process of sealing it in pencil began. I leaned over the wizard and checked his vitals, they were normal. Well, except for the painful spasm of many muscles in his body, the rapid heartbeat, and a face distorted by pain. It took only a couple of seconds for the ritual scheme to finish its work and fade out, leaving behind only engraved patterns on the floor. The wizard was still alive. I walked over to the pencil on the floor and took it in my hands, a strange sensation, but somehow subtly similar to Riddle's diary. And the locket, of course. I went beyond the edge of the circuit and sat on the floor, waiting for the subject to come to his senses. After a couple of minutes, the test subject recovered, and after assessing his position, tried to crawl away again, carefully imitating a caterpillar. However, it remains a mystery to me, where is he actually going to run? In a confined space. Taking the wand in my hand again, I pointed to the test subject without further ado, sending a clot of cumillaris into him, scattering the wizard's body. Curiously enough, a clot of the fog of a gloomy bluish hue hung in place of the body. It was small, no bigger than a tennis ball. This clot didn't seem to understand what it was doing here, and if you watch a little longer, you will notice that this clot seems to continue to crawl along the trajectory chosen by the subject. If it's a soul, then he didn't even realize he was dead, Rowena rightly pointed out. The clot began to fade as if it was going into invisibility. Without giving it such an opportunity, I literally jumped on the spot, instantly flying up to the clot and cutting it with a newly materialized sword, mentally giving the command to the sword, destroy. The clot literally flew apart in a rapidly disappearing cloud of fog, and in its place for a couple of moments hung a tiny, almost indistinguishable point of light, which literally fell into space. He's passed on. So, with my sword, I destroyed all that was on his soul and left without all this. That very piece no longer had any attachment to the Horcrux, as in fact memories, will, mind and other things, and therefore freely left the world. It looks that way, but it needs confirmation. After destroying the Horcrux pencil with my sword, I pulled out the rest of the figurines. Time for experiments. Chapter 408. It took me almost a day of complete self-isolation in the ritual hall of the Black's home to get a strong headache at my disposal, along with more or less formed concepts of the soul, Horcrux, and the capabilities of my sword. The first thing to note, and what is the most important achievement, is the firm belief that the soul really has a core around which everything else grows. Even if this confidence has no mathematical or any other scientific justification, but the usual observations of the course of experiments were enough for me. I even had to ask Kriaker to catch or buy some animals for the variety and purity of the experiment. He fulfilled this request. Experiments with the creation of Horcruxes of animals made it clear that a certain core of the soul of humans and animals looks and feels the same. Still, everything else that accumulates around this core is different both qualitatively and quantitatively. The second important observation is that the cleansed core really has no connection with the Horcrux. The anchor can be called in different ways. Yes, Rowena and I thought about this after the first experiment, but all subsequent experiments have shown that it is the fat that the core has grown over during life, being separated and protected from the dispersion by binding to matter. That is the reason why a soul with the remnants of fat, if there is will and desire, can remain in the world. I even conducted one experiment in which I separated the soul of a subject, but I didn't make a Horcrux out of the resulting part but simply kept it in the ritual scheme. While the shard is inside the circuit, the soul of the murdered subject still remains in the world, but as soon as the scheme is broken, it seems to fall into space together with the shard. The third important observation is that my spirit sword is a unique tool for working with the soul. Of course, I understood this before, but now this understanding has acquired a slightly different level. Very specific magical skills, knowledge, and calculations are needed to work with the soul. Any attempt to do as wizards are used to with a wave of a wand always turns out to be a failure due to the huge consumption of magic or the disruption of the contours of almost formed spells. However, the sword, being a kind of materialization of my own soul, works perfectly with other souls. All these thoughts began to take shape, albeit not very clear, but the idea of how to kill Voldemort bypassing his Horcruxes. I just need to cut him down. It sounds extremely easy and about as difficult to do. There is a lot of his own magic around him, and he can easily control this magic. Take, for example, one of the variants of telekinesis. With the help of magic you direct your magic in a trickle to an object and broadcast your desire to it, take off. Or whatever. Voldemort is surrounded by a huge amount of magic, occupying about 2 meters in radius. In this zone, he doesn't need volitional efforts to perform simple manipulations with its help, and the sensitivity to magical and other manifestations should be simply enormous. Perhaps his magic takes up such a volume when he is in combat mode, but it is worth counting on the worst, taking as an axiom that this is his natural background. The problem here is that there's simply no way to get to him. No way, at all. All manipulations take time, and even to just fall out of the shadows and strike, I will need time for which he will easily react. Delphina has a magical background similar in nature, but there it is smaller and quieter. So does Dumbledore, but the volume is within reason. Unlike the density of magic, but the density is a product of control and active thinking. That's why when the headmaster manifests his magical power, it's as if he glows in perception. Without light, of course, as well as other visual manifestations, it is only an association. A kind of flicker from the density of magic. And Voldemort is pressing. It's hard to put that kind of feeling into words. You could solve this problem with a firearm, for example. Take a bullet, enlarge it with Engorgo, apply the necessary runes, return it to its original size, put it back in the cartridge, and that's it, the weapon is ready. However, this is only a means of killing the body, and I need to get Voldemort with a sword. It's possible to implement a soul catcher in a bullet, but the problem is that the soul catcher and the soul don't get along well together. This is related to the problem of the short shelf life of the soul in the soul catcher. And if the soul understands exactly what happened, it will be able to free itself. Well, at least I think so. And Voldemort has a lot of experience living without a body. After weighing all the pros and cons, having dined on Kriaker's culinary masterpieces, I left the house on Grimmauld. There wasn't a star in the already darkened London night sky, just a glow from the city in the clouds. There was almost no snow left from the recent snowfall, and the festive mood from various decorations no longer appeared. Christmas is tomorrow. Chapter 409. How to get close to Voldemort or break through his defenses. He is stronger, more experienced. And in the end, he's just angrier. This is important, given his dark magical specialization. From a tactical point of view, I just need to wait for some kind of mess with his participation, guess the moment, and get closer by striking with his sword. But when will it be? It's hard to say. And problems can start at any moment. I have attracted his attention. I have to finish him off. If you believe the rumors at Hogwarts and Tonks words, then cases of missing wizards have already become more frequent. I can bet that ordinary people as well. How to overpower Voldemort in a direct confrontation, direct and uncompromising. I'm detecting the birth of a brilliant idea. Rowena's snide voice in my head knocked me off this very thought. Go see Delphine. Why, I said out loud, unwittingly, but it was this mistake that managed to get my thoughts back on track. Without warning about my visit in advance, I apparat at the coordinates known to me to the place to which I had access. Once on the apparition platform near Lady Greengrass's country house, which was still covered with snow, I walked along the path to the wooden mansion, inadvertently admiring the barely visible pale blue snow around and the tall coniferous trees of the forest standing very close to it. A soft yellow light was burning in the house's windows, which gave hope that Delphine was at home. When I reached the door, it swung open to let me in, and then slammed shut when I walked in. Standing in the vestibule, which was level below the general floor, I enjoyed breathing in the warm air with pine scents wafting through it. The source of the scent interested me, and as soon as I cleared myself with magic and walked into the spacious main hall, lit by the fireplace and a couple of lights, I immediately noticed the decorated Christmas tree. Everything on it was as it should be, colorful shiny balls of different sizes, stars, soft yellow lights like garlands. Without an invitation, came Delphine's voice, coming from the big sofa in front of the fireplace. There was no reproach in this voice, just a statement of fact. I walked across the hall and sat down in an armchair that stood, as it were, between the sofa and the fireplace. Delphine was sitting relaxed on this big sofa, dressed in a rather simple and long light dress. Her thick braid of almost white hair rested habitually on her right shoulder. In her hands, Lady Greengrass was holding a book that she had apparently been reading before my visit. Not much light, but enough, and there are spells for such situations. I apologize for the late unannounced visit, I apologized, looking at Delphine. She closed the book, placed it on her lap, and looked back at me. Has something happened? I need your help. Delphine nodded, like, go on. But I turned my gaze to the decorated Christmas tree. Christmas. A good reason for a beautiful decoration, Lady Greengrass shrugged. Can you arrange the same ritual as last time? Why? I stared at Delphine for a few seconds and didn't know exactly what to say. But what's the point of spreading secrecy out of the blue in that state? I plan to destroy the Dark Lord. Delphine opened her eyes wide in surprise, looking at me. What nonsense! She shook her head dejectedly. Lady Greengrass. But Delphine interrupted my beginning speech with a stopping gesture of her hand. I didn't spend a lot of time and effort on your training so that you would go and kill yourself at the Dark Lord. I have calculated and thought everything out. You're forgetting about the prophecy, she said somewhat harsher. And we don't know its contents, I responded similarly to her. Dumbledore is silent, and Potter has lost this prophecy. That's it. And if indeed only young Mr. Potter is capable of defeating the Dark Lord, then how will your fight end, no matter how strong you make yourself? I'll slip on my robe like Dumbledore. Delphine looked at me in surprise. You don't know yet. Oh. Chapter 410. Without much enthusiasm, simply and factually, I told about the recent events at the ministry. Delphine listened calmly, without emotion, clarifying only a few points of interest to her. You have revealed yourself too much, she stated the obvious fact when I finished my story. The Dark Lord let you go, but he didn't know yet how much damage you did to his elite. Now he knows for sure, and you really caught his attention. That's why I need this ritual. All in, so to speak. Delphine shook her head again. It's not easy for me to decide to hand you the means to go on a suicide mission. So, look at it from a different angle, I smiled. You will hand me the means so that by going, I will not kill myself. What about the prophecy? If there is even a slight chance that only Potter can defeat the Dark Lord because of it, then all your attempts will be useless and will only lead you, at best, to death. I was a little hesitant here, but as I know, it is extremely difficult to break the prophecy, and forces outside of this world are capable of doing so. Even if you consider that I appeared before the utterance of the prophecy, my spiritual weapon arrived years after the utterance of the prophecy. There's a good chance it could be considered an out-of-this-world force. I have to try. I don't know, and I'm afraid to even guess how long it will take for Potter to defeat the Dark Lord. 6 months, a year, 10 years. What can happen during this time already now? By circumstantial evidence, we can count at least a dozen victims among wizards and an unknown number among ordinary people. There will be more. You're worried not about them, are you? Smiled Delphine weakly, looking at me. It wasn't so much a question as a statement. Yes, I decided not to lie. I am concerned about my well-being and the people important to me. The activities of the Dark Lord, which he may soon promote, as well as his attention to me, are not at all conducive to that well-being. Well, and time is working against me. Delphine looked at me in silence, tapping her index finger on the cover of the book lying in her lap. She was clearly thinking about something. How to bury me herself so that others wouldn't get that honor. All right. After all, if I don't help, you'll come up with some unusual way to get what you want on your own. Right. The corners of Delphine's mouth twitched slightly, expressing a very slight smile. Come back in 3 days. I'll prepare everything. Judging by the fact that Delphine opened the book again right after that sentence, I could tell that she was somewhat disappointed, offended in general. She expressed her displeasure. Thank you, I smiled and, getting up from the chair, went to the exit of the house. When I reached the apparition site, I moved to the border of the protective barrier of Hogwarts and, on the move, conjuring a complex of concealing charms on myself, hurriedly moved to the castle. When I got inside, I wasn't surprised by the silence and the dimmed lights out. After sneaking in quietly and passing McGonagall patrolling the castle, I had no trouble getting to the common room, where some of the members of the recent operation to rescue Sirius were found. Taking off my disguise, I proceeded to an empty sofa and, with some fatigue, simply flopped down on it, spreading myself unwillingly on such a comfortable seat. My return didn't go unnoticed, but only the twins approached me. Max, the left one spoke, keeping an atypical seriousness on his face. We wanted to thank you. To my surprise, the other twin did not continue the sentence. For what? For saving us, the first said again, and the second only nodded. Your advice on spells for training, your help at the ministry. Without that, we could have easily died. I could only nod at that. After a quick look around the common room, I noticed other members of that action, along with the ordinary members of Dumbledore's army. Yes, not everyone was here. Yes, there were guys from other houses, but it's not uncommon friends bring friends. Are you thanking me on behalf of everyone else? Don't get them wrong. The other twin smiled a little sadly. They're grateful, too, just afraid of you. Everything came back to normal, and the twins began to finish phrases one for the other. Afraid? Well, of course. The second one smiled sparingly. You've shown yourself to be a very powerful wizard. We haven't seen anything like this yet. And how should I say? Killed, the first twin finished clearly, immediately placing his palms out in front of him in a defensive gesture. No, we don't blame you. After all, they were the wizards without whom the world would be a better place. And Azkaban has proven to be no panacea. Okay, guys. Where's Hermione? In her room, I think. Probably asleep. It's late. And she hasn't looked up from her books since we got back. Thanks, I nodded to the guys, and they nodded back and returned to the others. There was nothing else for me to do in the common room, so I went to shower and sleep.
That is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please drop a comment down below.